The word landed in the breakfast room like a drop of ink in clear water, spreading through the silence before anyone could pretend they had not heard it. A broodmare, Margaret Graves repeated, lifting her porcelain cup with elegant fingers. That is what she is it not? We all know why my brother married her. No one moved. No one breathed. At the head of the long mahogany table, Alexander Graves, Duke of Harrington, slowly set down his knife. The faint metallic sound against the china plate seemed louder than Margaret's insult. Clara Whitfield felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She kept her posture straight. She folded her hands carefully in her lap beneath the tablecloth. She had spent 6 months learning that survival in a great house often depended on remaining perfectly still while others decided what she was worth. Outside the tall windows, a pale spring rain drifted across the gardens of Harrington House. The gray morning light softened the ancient stone walls and silvered the hedges beyond. Inside, however, nothing felt soft. The room smelled of coffee, fresh bread, and tension. Margaret smiled as though she had merely commented on the weather. Surely nobody is shocked. The estate needed money. Clara's family had plenty of it. My brother needed an heir. The arrangement appears obvious. Clara lowered her eyes briefly toward her untouched breakfast. She had known this day would come. Perhaps not this exact moment. Perhaps not this exact word. Yet ever since her wedding, she had sensed the judgment waiting beneath every polite smile. She was American. She was wealthy. She was not born into one of England's ancient noble families. To many people, that made her an outsider who had purchased a title. The fact that she had not conceived a child during the first 6 months of marriage only made the whispers louder. Across from Margaret sat Lady Beatrice Holloway, a distant cousin who seemed fascinated by her plate. Beside her, Lord Edwin Graves adjusted his spectacles and suddenly found the silver coffee pot remarkably interesting. Nobody rushed to defend Clara. Nobody ever did. Margaret glanced around the table and laughed softly. Good heavens! You all look horrified. I did not mean it cruelly. Clara finally raised her head. Her expression remained calm. That is comforting to know. Margaret's smile widened. I simply speak plainly. Society speaks less honestly, but it reaches the same conclusion. Clara met her gaze. And what conclusion would that be? Margaret leaned back in her chair. That a duchess who cannot provide an heir eventually becomes a very expensive decoration. The words struck harder than the first insult. Not because they were new. Clara had heard versions of them before. In drawing rooms. In opera houses. In conversations that stopped the moment she approached. Yet hearing them spoken openly at the family table carried a different sting. She remembered another breakfast table thousands of miles away. Sunlight through broad windows. Her father's laughter. Her mother's warm hand resting over hers. Whitfield Manor in Connecticut had never possessed the grandeur of Harrington House, but it had always contained something this magnificent estate often lacked. Kindness. Clara's father had built his fortune through shipping and railroads. He believed a person's character mattered more than their title. Growing up, Clara had believed the rest of the world shared that view. Then she had crossed the Atlantic. Then she had entered aristocratic society. Then she had learned how quickly people measured a woman's value. Margaret reached for a strawberry preserve. Of course. Perhaps we are all worrying unnecessarily. Her tone dripped with false sympathy. There is still time. 6 months is not terribly long. Clara felt heat rise beneath her skin. She hated that. She hated giving Margaret even the smallest victory. I appreciate your concern. Margaret laughed again. Do not pretend I am concerned. A footman standing near the wall nearly dropped the silver serving tray in his hands. The poor man looked ready to disappear into the wallpaper. Clara almost envied him. She could feel Alexander's silence more than his presence. The Duke had not spoken since Margaret uttered the word broodmare. He sat motionless at the head of the table. His dark suit was immaculate. His expression was unreadable. He had always possessed that ability. Other men filled a room through noise. Alexander filled it through restraint. When Clara had first met him, she had mistaken that restraint for coldness. 6 months later, She still was not entirely certain she understood him. Their marriage had never been a romance. Both of them knew that. Harrington estate had suffered years of financial decline. Her father had supplied the investment that saved it. In return, Clara received a title and a place beside one of the most powerful men in England. The arrangement had been practical, respectable, mutually beneficial. At least that was how society described it. The truth felt more complicated. Alexander had never treated her poorly. He had never humiliated her. He had never spoken to her with cruelty. Yet he remained distant enough that Clara often wondered what existed beneath the surface of his composure. Margaret set down her spoon. Perhaps the doctors should be consulted. The room became even quieter. "Margaret," Lord Edwin murmured. She ignored him. "I only mean that science exists for a reason. If there is a problem, surely it is better to identify it." Clara's fingers tightened beneath the table. "I do not believe my medical affairs are a topic for breakfast conversation. And yet here we are." Margaret tilted her head. "You must understand the family's concern." "The family's concern?" Clara repeated softly. "Or yours?" For the first time, Margaret's smile faltered. Only slightly. Only for a moment. But Clara saw it. "I care deeply about Harrington's future." "As do I." Margaret looked ready to respond. She never had the opportunity. The sound of a chair moving across polished wood interrupted her. Everyone turned. Alexander rose to his feet. He was not an excessively tall man, yet something about his presence seemed to command space. The room felt smaller the moment he stood. Margaret straightened. Surprise flickered across her face. "Alexander!" He looked at her. Nothing more. Just looked. Clara had witnessed experienced politicians become uncomfortable beneath that gaze. The silence stretched. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Finally, Alexander spoke. His voice was calm. "Leave." Margaret blinked. "Excuse me?" "Leave this house." The words arrived without anger, without raised volume, without visible emotion. That somehow made them more powerful. Margaret laughed uncertainly. "Surely you are joking." "I am not." "Alexander, I merely made an observation." "You insulted my wife." "I stated a fact." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Alexander took a single step forward. "You will leave Harrington House within the hour." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Margaret stared at him as though she no longer recognized her own brother. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." "Because of one comment?" Alexander's expression never changed. "Because of repeated comments." Margaret's confidence began to crack. "She is turning you against your own family." Clara almost laughed at that. If only Margaret knew how little influence Clara actually possessed over the Duke. "This decision is mine," Alexander said. "You will apologize to the Duchess." Margaret looked toward Clara. Rage flashed behind her eyes. Then pride replaced it. "No." Alexander nodded once. "Then you will leave without an apology." The finality in his voice settled over the room like stone. Margaret pushed back her chair. "This is absurd." No one answered. She looked from face to face. Nobody came to her defense. Even Lord Edwin remained silent. At last, she gathered her napkin and dropped it onto the table. "Very well." Her gaze settled on Clara one final time. "Enjoy your victory." Clara did not respond. Margaret turned sharply and crossed the room. The breakfast room doors opened, then closed. The echo lingered long after she disappeared. Silence followed. Heavy, uncomfortable, real. Alexander returned to his seat. He lifted his coffee cup as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Clara stared at him. She was not certain what shocked her more, the fact that he had defended her, or the fact that he had done so without hesitation. Around them, the remaining family members exchanged uncertain glances. One by one they resumed eating. Conversation did not return. Could not. Something fundamental had shifted. Clara lowered her eyes to her plate again. though she no longer saw the food. Her heart beat harder than it should have. She had entered this room expecting another ordinary humiliation. Instead, she had witnessed the most powerful man she knew draw a line that nobody had expected him to draw. Across the table, Alexander continued drinking his coffee. Calm, controlled, unreadable. Yet for the first time since their wedding day, Clara wondered whether she had misunderstood him entirely. Outside, the rain continued to fall across Harrington Estate. Inside, the breakfast room remained quiet. But beneath that quiet, something had begun. Neither of them yet understood what it would become. Clara remained at the breakfast table long after the others had excused themselves. The room that had felt crowded only an hour earlier now seemed impossibly large. Rain continued to drift against the windows in thin silver lines. A fire crackled quietly in the marble hearth. Somewhere beyond the closed doors, the vast machinery of Harrington House carried on as though nothing remarkable had occurred. Servants moved through hallways. Housekeepers directed maids. Footmen answered bells. Yet Clara knew the entire household would be discussing what had happened before noon. Great houses survived on routine, but they thrived on gossip. She looked down at her untouched coffee. It had gone cold, not unlike many things in her life. 6 months earlier she had crossed the threshold of Harrington House for the first time as a newly married duchess. She still remembered the carriage ride, the endless countryside, the heavy gray sky, the enormous stone mansion emerging beyond acres of manicured grounds. It had looked less like a home and more like a monument built by generations determined never to be forgotten. At 26 years old, Clara Whitfield had thought herself prepared for the challenges ahead. She had been wrong. The marriage itself had never been disguised as a love match. Everyone involved understood the terms. Harrington Estate needed money. The Whitfields possessed more money than many noble families combined. Alexander Graves needed financial stability for the ancient lands entrusted to him. Her father wanted security and status for his daughter. The arrangement made perfect sense on paper. Society approved of practical marriages. Society often preferred them. Love was considered unreliable. Wealth and titles were easier to calculate. Clara rose from her chair and walked slowly toward the window. The gardens stretched across nearly 50 acres. Formal hedges curved around fountains and stone pathways. Beyond them lay forests and fields that had belonged to the Graves family for centuries. The estate was beautiful. Everyone said so. Visitors praised its grandeur constantly. They admired the architecture. They admired the history. They admired the title attached to it. Very few people ever wondered what it felt like to live there. Clara pressed her fingertips lightly against the cool glass. In Connecticut, mornings had been different. Her father's house overlooked the water. Seagulls often cried above the harbor. The smell of salt lingered in the air. Merchants, sailors, and businessmen arrived daily. Nobody cared which ancestors had owned what land 200 years earlier. They cared about what a person could build, what a person could accomplish, what kind of character they possessed. Her father often said that money could open doors, but character determined what happened after they opened. She smiled faintly at the memory. Theodore Whitfield had never intended for his daughter to marry a duke. In fact, he had laughed at the idea years before. Then reality had intervened. Investments expanded. Wealth accumulated. Invitations arrived from increasingly prestigious circles. Eventually, the Atlantic Ocean seemed smaller than ambition. By the time Clara reached her early 20s, European aristocrats had begun appearing at dinners and social events. Some were charming. Some were intelligent. Many were desperate. Old titles often came attached to aging fortunes. New money frequently offered solutions. Clara had learned that lesson quickly. She had become skilled at recognizing certain looks, calculating looks, evaluating looks. Men who appeared fascinated by her personality until they discovered the size of her inheritance. Men who praised her intelligence while quietly asking questions about trust funds and business holdings. She hated it, not because she was naive. She understood how the world worked. She simply wanted to be seen as something more than an account ledger wearing an expensive dress. A knock sounded softly at the door. Clara turned. One of the maids stepped inside carrying a silver tray. "Your Grace, would you like fresh coffee?" Clara offered a gentle smile. "Thank you, Anna. That would be lovely." The young woman approached and replaced the cup. Clara noticed the maid seemed unusually nervous. "Is something wrong?" Anna immediately shook her head. "No, Your Grace." Then she hesitated. "Everyone is talking about this morning." Clara nearly laughed. At least someone was honest. "I imagined they might be." Anna lowered her voice. "Most of the staff are very pleased." Clara blinked. "Pleased?" The maid nodded quickly. "His Grace has never allowed anyone to speak disrespectfully about the Duchess." People noticed. A strange feeling settled inside Clara. Gratitude mixed with uncertainty. "Thank you, Anna." The young woman curtsied and left. Once alone again, Clara stared into her fresh coffee. Never allowed anyone to speak disrespectfully about the Duchess. The statement should have comforted her. Instead, it raised questions she did not know how to answer. Because the truth was more complicated. Alexander had never insulted her. He had never treated her cruelly. Yet neither had he offered affection. Their relationship existed within careful boundaries. Polite, respectful, controlled. During the first weeks of marriage, she had assumed distance was temporary. Many arranged marriages required time. Trust rarely appeared overnight. Then the weeks became months. The distance remained. Not hostile distance. Not painful distance. Simply the measured separation of two people who occupied the same world without fully entering each other's lives. Clara left the breakfast room and made her way upstairs. Portraits of long-dead Graves' ancestors lined the walls. Dukes, duchesses, military officers, statesmen, men and women who stared down from gilded frames as though silently evaluating every generation that followed. She often felt them watching her. Not literally, of course. Yet their presence filled the house. The Graves family history surrounded her constantly. Every hallway reminded visitors that Harrington existed long before Clara arrived and would continue long after she was gone. That realization sometimes felt lonely. Her bedroom overlooked the eastern gardens. Sunlight occasionally filled the room during clear mornings. Today, only gray clouds appeared beyond the windows. Clara crossed to her writing desk and opened a drawer. Inside lay a stack of letters tied neatly with a blue ribbon. Letters from home. She selected one at random. The paper had softened from repeated handling. Her mother's handwriting flowed elegantly across the page. "Clara, my darling girl, remember that your worth cannot be measured by titles, expectations, or the opinions of people who do not truly know you." Reading the words brought an ache she had become familiar with. Homesickness never disappeared completely. It merely learned how to hide. She folded the letter carefully. Her mother had written those words 3 months earlier after hearing rumors from London. Rumors traveled remarkably fast across oceans, especially unpleasant ones. Questions about heirs had begun almost immediately after the wedding. At first the comments seemed harmless. Casual inquiries, polite observations. Then came the subtle suggestions. Then the comparisons. Then the speculation. Clara was not foolish. She understood why aristocratic families valued heirs. Entire estates depended upon succession. Generations of planning revolved around continuity. Yet she increasingly felt reduced to a single biological function. At dinners, people asked about children before asking about her interests. At social gatherings, older women offered fertility advice she had never requested. Some spoke to her as though she were a promising racehorse expected to produce successful offspring. The humiliation came not from one dramatic moment. It came from accumulation. Hundreds of small cuts disguised as conversation. Clara closed the drawer and crossed to the fireplace. The room felt colder than usual. She extended her hands toward the warmth. 6 months. Only 6 months. Rationally she knew that was not a long time. Yet society behaved as though she had already failed some invisible examination. The most frustrating part was knowing she could never fully escape the scrutiny. Even if she produced an heir tomorrow, expectations would simply change shape. There would be another obligation, another standard, another reason for judgment. A soft sigh escaped her. Perhaps that was why Margaret's words had hurt more than she wanted to admit. Not because they were cruel, because they reflected something many people already believed. A carriage rattled faintly outside. Clara glanced toward the window. Visitors often arrived unexpectedly at great houses. News traveled fast among the aristocracy. She suspected today's events would inspire fresh interest. By evening, half of London might know that the Duke of Harrington had expelled his own sister from the family home. Some would applaud him. Others would call it excessive. Many would blame Clara. She could already imagine the conversations. The American wife had driven a wedge between brother and sister. The American wife was overly sensitive. The American wife did not understand tradition. The American wife. Always the American wife. Rarely Clara. She moved toward the mirror above the mantel. Her reflection stared back. Chestnut hair. Gray-blue eyes. Features her mother once described as quietly elegant. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing scandalous. Yet somehow enough to attract endless opinions from strangers. "You look tired," she told her reflection softly. The woman in the mirror appeared to agree. A faint knock interrupted her thoughts. Clara turned. This time it was her lady's maid, Eleanor. "Your Grace." "Yes." Eleanor entered carrying a garment bag. "The blue afternoon gown has returned from alterations." Clara nodded. Then she noticed the maid's expression. Curious, cautious, waiting. "You have heard about breakfast as well?" Eleanor tried unsuccessfully to hide a smile. "Everyone has." Clara laughed despite herself. A genuine laugh. Small but real. The first of the day. "Then I suppose there is no point pretending otherwise." Eleanor relaxed. "If I may say so, Your Grace, many people underestimate you." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Do they?" "Frequently." Clara considered that after the maid left. Perhaps Eleanor was right. People underestimated her because she remained polite, because she avoided scenes, because she preferred dignity over confrontation. They mistook restraint for weakness. It was a mistake she had allowed for years. Yet as afternoon light slowly brightened beyond the clouds, another thought emerged. Alexander had not defended weakness at breakfast. He had defended dignity. The distinction mattered. She was still trying to decide why. And for the first time since arriving at Harrington House, she found herself genuinely wanting to know the answer. Late afternoon settled over Harrington House beneath a blanket of silver clouds. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the gardens washed clean and glistening beyond the tall windows. Clara sat alone in the small blue drawing room on the second floor, a book resting open in her lap. She had been staring at the same page for nearly 10 minutes. The words refused to hold her attention. Her thoughts kept returning to breakfast. Not to Margaret. Not even to the insult itself. Her mind returned again and again to the moment Alexander had stood. To the calm certainty in his voice. To the fact that he had chosen action when silence would have been easier. A knock sounded at the door. Clara looked up. "Come in." The butler entered. "Your Grace." "His Grace requests a few moments of your time." Clara closed the book carefully. Her pulse quickened despite herself. "Where is he?" "In the West Library, Your Grace." The butler bowed and withdrew. Clara remained seated for a moment. The West Library was one of Alexander's favorite rooms in the house. He handled estate business there, reviewed correspondence, met with solicitors and advisors. He rarely invited anyone into that space without purpose. She rose and smoothed the front of her navy blue afternoon gown. Then she left the drawing room and made her way through the quiet corridors. Harrington House always seemed to grow more solemn in the late afternoon. Sunlight faded. Shadows lengthened. The portraits along the walls appeared more watchful. As Clara descended the grand staircase, she found herself wondering what Alexander intended to say. During 6 months of marriage, they had developed a comfortable routine. respectful conversations, shared meals, occasional discussions about estate matters. Yet neither of them sought emotional conversations. They moved around each other with care, two people attempting not to disturb wounds they could not see. The West Library occupied a corner of the ground floor overlooking the southern lawns. Massive shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Leather-bound books filled every available inch. A fire burned steadily in the hearth despite the mild spring weather. When Clara entered, Alexander stood near one of the windows. He held a letter in one hand. The fading light outlined the broad lines of his shoulders. He looked up when she approached. "Thank you for coming." "Of course." He gestured toward a chair near the fireplace. "Please sit." Clara obeyed. Alexander remained standing for a moment before crossing the room and taking the chair opposite hers. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was simply familiar. They had become experts at silence. Alexander placed the letter on a nearby table. "Margaret has left the estate." Clara nodded. "I assumed she would." "She was angry." Clara almost smiled. "That does not surprise me either." A faint flicker of amusement appeared in his eyes before vanishing again. "No, I suppose it would not." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "Was there a reason you wished to see me?" Alexander studied her for several seconds. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Finally he spoke. "I wanted to address what happened this morning." Clara held his gaze. "Very well. Margaret's behavior was unacceptable. I believe that point was made rather clearly." His mouth twitched slightly. It was not quite a smile. "Perhaps." Clara waited. The fire crackled softly between them. Alexander looked toward the flames for a moment before continuing. "You should not have been placed in that position." There it was. An apology, or something close to one. Yet the words felt strangely formal. Clara appreciated the effort. At the same time, she sensed he was still holding something back. "I have been in similar positions before." His gaze returned to her. "At Harrington?" "Everywhere." Clara leaned back slightly. People rarely bother to hide their opinions when they think a woman cannot change anything. Alexander's expression darkened. "You should not accept that. Accepting reality and approving of it are not the same thing." Silence returned. Clara could feel the conversation approaching something important. Neither of them seemed entirely certain how to reach it. At last she asked the question that had occupied her thoughts all day. "Why did you do it?" Alexander frowned slightly. "Do what?" "Dismiss your sister." His eyes narrowed. "Not with anger, with concentration." "Because she insulted you." Clara shook her head. "That is not the entire reason." He remained silent. "Margaret has made comments before," Clara continued. "Not as direct as this morning, perhaps, but similar. You heard some of them." Alexander did not deny it. "You tolerated them." "I did." "Then why now?" The question lingered between them. For the first time since she had entered the room, Alexander looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not visibly, not dramatically, yet Clara noticed the slight tightening of his jaw, the shift in his posture. Small signs, easy to miss unless one paid attention. She was beginning to realize that Alexander revealed himself in fragments, tiny cracks in an otherwise flawless wall. "Because this morning was different," he said finally. Clara waited. "How?" He exhaled slowly. "Because she intended to humiliate you." Clara almost laughed. "Margaret always intends to humiliate people." "Not like that." The firmness in his voice surprised her. Alexander leaned forward slightly. "There is a difference between disagreement and cruelty." Clara felt something shift inside her. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. The conviction sounded personal, deeply personal, as though he spoke from experience. She studied him carefully. "You seem unusually certain of that distinction." His gaze held hers. For a moment she thought he might answer honestly. Then the familiar reserve returned. "Perhaps I am." Clara looked away first. The disappointment surprised her. She had not realized she wanted honesty until she nearly received it. Alexander stood and crossed toward a nearby desk. He opened a drawer and removed a small leather ledger. There is another matter. Clara accepted the change in subject with quiet resignation. What matter? He handed her the ledger. Household accounts. Clara blinked. Household accounts? You are the Duchess of Harrington. I am aware. Another brief flicker of amusement appeared. Good. Then this should not be entirely shocking. Clara opened the ledger. Pages of figures filled the book. Expenses, inventories, staffing records, supply purchases. She looked up. Why are you showing me this? Alexander returned to his chair. Because beginning next week, all household management decisions will come through you. Clara stared at him. I beg your pardon? The authority traditionally belongs to the Duchess. Margaret has been handling many of those responsibilities. Margaret no longer lives here. Clara looked down at the ledger again, then back at Alexander. You are serious. Entirely. A strange combination of emotions rushed through her. Surprise, uncertainty, gratitude, fear. Not fear of responsibility. She had managed portions of her father's charitable foundation before marriage. Numbers did not frighten her. What unsettled her was the trust implied by the gesture. This is a considerable amount of authority. It should have been yours from the beginning. Clara hesitated. Why was it not? Alexander was silent long enough to answer the question without speaking. Margaret, family expectations, old habits, tradition. Any of those explanations might have been true. Eventually he said, I made a mistake. Clara stared at him. In 6 months she had never heard Alexander Graves admit to one. Not because he was arrogant. Simply because he seemed incapable of making careless decisions. Yet there it was. A straightforward acknowledgement. No excuses. No qualifications. Just a fact. She lowered her eyes to the ledger. Thank you. You do not need to thank me. Perhaps not. Clara traced a fingertip along the worn leather cover. But I still do. Another silence settled over the room. This one felt different. Softer somehow. Less guarded. Outside, the clouds finally began to break apart. A narrow beam of sunlight stretched across the lawn. Gold light filtered through the library windows and touched the edge of Alexander's face. Clara noticed how tired he looked. Not physically, emotionally, like a man carrying responsibilities too heavy to discuss. The realization stirred an unexpected sympathy. May I ask you something? She said quietly. Of course. Do you always solve problems by removing people from your life? The question escaped before she could reconsider it. Alexander looked genuinely surprised, then thoughtful. No. It appeared rather effortless this morning. His gaze drifted toward the window. It was not effortless. Clara waited. Margaret and I have disagreed for years, he said. She believes loyalty means never questioning family. And you disagree? I believe loyalty without accountability becomes something else. Clara absorbed that. It sounded less like a statement about Margaret and more like a principle he lived by. She wondered how many difficult decisions that principle had cost him over the years. You love your sister. It was not a question. Alexander nodded once. Yes. Yet you still sent her away. Yes. Clara studied him carefully. Then she asked the question she had not intended to ask. Did you do it for the family's reputation? The answer came immediately. No. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. Then why? For a long moment Alexander said nothing. The fire crackled softly. The last traces of rain slid down the library windows. Finally he spoke. His voice was quieter than before. Because you deserved better. The words were simple. No grand declaration. No dramatic emotion. Yet something about them struck harder than any speech could have. Clara looked down quickly. Not because she was embarrassed. Because she suddenly found it difficult to breathe normally. For 6 months she had felt like a necessary addition to Harrington House. Practical solution. A financial answer to an aristocratic problem. No one had ever suggested she deserved anything. Certainly not better. She gathered herself before speaking. That is a dangerous thing to tell a woman. To her surprise, Alexander smiled. An actual smile. Small. Brief. Real. Why? Clara looked back at him. Because once she hears it, she might begin believing it. For the first time since entering the room, warmth entered his eyes. Not romance. Not yet. Something quieter. Respect. Perhaps she should. Neither spoke after that. The conversation had reached a place neither knew how to navigate. Yet as evening settled over Harrington House and sunlight faded from the library windows, Clara found herself carrying the ledger against her chest like something unexpectedly precious. Not because of the authority it represented. Because for the first time since becoming Duchess of Harrington, someone had treated her as though she belonged there. And for the first time since their wedding, Alexander Graves had begun lowering the walls between them, one carefully measured stone at a time. 3 days later, London began talking. Clara knew it before anyone told her. Great cities had their own weather. Not rain or sunshine. Rumors. They drifted through drawing rooms and carriage rides. They settled over luncheon tables and opera boxes. They appeared in carefully lowered voices and vanished the moment the subject entered the room. By the 4th morning after Margaret's departure, Harrington House had received 6 social invitations, 3 polite inquiries, and 1 astonishingly transparent letter from a Countess Clara had met exactly once. The Countess claimed to be checking on Clara's health. The second paragraph asked whether the recent family disagreement had arisen from difficulties regarding succession. Clara folded the letter and placed it aside. "Subtle," she murmured. Eleanor, arranging flowers nearby, tried unsuccessfully not to smile. "People are curious, Your Grace." Curious is a generous description. Clara glanced toward the growing pile of correspondence. "Vultures are also curious." Eleanor covered a laugh. "That is true." Clara rose from her desk and crossed to the window. The weather had finally turned warmer. Bright sunlight stretched across the lawns of Harrington Estate. Gardeners worked among rows of blooming roses. From a distance, everything looked peaceful. Inside society, however, a different reality was unfolding. During the previous 3 days, she had learned exactly how quickly one breakfast incident could evolve into a dozen different stories. In some versions, Margaret had heroically defended family interests. In others, Alexander had become irrationally devoted to his American wife. One particularly inventive rumor claimed Clara had manipulated the entire argument to isolate the Duke from his relatives. Another suggested that Margaret's departure proved there was already a serious problem with producing an heir. Apparently, the absence of facts only encouraged imagination. Clara turned away from the window. "Has His Grace returned from the estate offices?" Eleanor nodded. "About 15 minutes ago." Clara considered that. Since receiving authority over the household, her days had become surprisingly busy. She reviewed budgets, met with staff, inspected inventories, examined charitable accounts. To her surprise, she enjoyed the work. More importantly, she excelled at it. Years spent assisting her father had taught her practical skills many aristocratic women never acquired. The servants had noticed. So had Alexander. That realization brought an unexpected warmth she refused to examine too closely. She left her rooms and headed downstairs. She found Alexander in the West Library reviewing documents near the fireplace. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows behind him. He looked up as she entered. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon." Clara carried a folded letter in one hand. "I have received another expression of concern for my well-being." Alexander's expression immediately became suspicious. "How concerned?" Clara handed him the letter. He read it. One eyebrow slowly rose. "Remarkably concerned." "Indeed." He set the letter aside. "Would you like me to respond?" Clara considered the offer. A week earlier she might have accepted. Today she shook her head. "No." Alexander looked mildly surprised. "No. If I spend my life hiding behind your authority, people will never stop treating me like a problem to be managed." A thoughtful look crossed his face. "That is true." Clara sat in the chair opposite him. The real issue is not one countess. No. The rumors are spreading. Alexander leaned back. They are. Clara studied him. Unlike many men, he never pretended unpleasant realities did not exist. She appreciated that. Do they bother you? She asked. The rumors? Yes. Not particularly. Clara almost laughed. Of course they did not. Alexander seemed immune to social hysteria. I envy that. You should not. Why? His gaze settled on her. Because indifference has a cost. The answer surprised her. Before she could ask what cost he meant, a knock interrupted them. The butler entered carrying a silver tray. Several fresh letters rested upon it. Additional correspondence, Your Grace. Alexander accepted the tray. The butler withdrew. Clara watched as he sorted through the envelopes. One immediately caught his attention. The seal belonged to Margaret. She recognized it instantly. Alexander stared at the letter for several seconds. Then he placed it aside unopened. Clara blinked. You are not going to read it? Not today. His tone ended the discussion. Clara respected that. Still, she could not help wondering what Margaret might be planning. The answer arrived sooner than expected. 2 days later, Clara attended a charity tea hosted by Lady Ashcombe. The event took place in a grand townhouse overlooking Hyde Park. More than 40 women filled the elegant drawing rooms. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. Servants moved quietly among clusters of guests carrying silver trays and delicate pastries. It should have been a pleasant afternoon. Clara knew better almost immediately. The moment she entered, conversations shifted. Smiles appeared. Polite smiles. Curious smiles. The sort of smiles people wore when they desperately wanted information. Lady Ashcombe greeted her warmly. Your Grace, how lovely to see you. Thank you for inviting me. We were all hoping you would attend. Clara suspected that was true. The question was why. She spent the first half hour navigating conversations with practiced grace. Most remained harmless. Then the subject appeared. It always did. Lady Winthrop adjusted the lace cuff of her sleeve and sighed dramatically. Family expectations can be so difficult. Clara recognized the trap immediately. Sometimes. Another woman nodded. Particularly for young wives. A third added, the pressure to provide heirs must be exhausting. There it was. Clara lifted her teacup calmly. I imagine it is exhausting for everyone involved. Several women exchanged glances. Apparently that answer was not dramatic enough. Lady Winthrop leaned forward slightly. You are handling it remarkably well. Handling what? The attention. Clara smiled pleasantly. Attention eventually becomes background noise. A few women laughed. Others looked disappointed. The conversation drifted elsewhere. For several minutes. Then another guest approached. Then another. Different wording. Same curiosity. The questions circled endlessly around marriage, heirs, expectations, and family disagreements. By the time Clara stepped onto a small terrace overlooking the garden, she felt tired. Not defeated. Simply tired. Fresh spring air greeted her. The terrace was empty. For the first time all afternoon she relaxed. You always were stubborn. Clara froze. She recognized the voice instantly. Margaret stood near the far end of the terrace. Dressed in pale green silk. Perfectly composed. As though she had never left Harrington House at all. Clara turned slowly. Good afternoon. Margaret smiled. Is it? That depends on your intentions. A brief flash of irritation crossed Margaret's face. Then it disappeared. You have become more confident. Perhaps. Margaret stepped closer. Alexander has been very protective lately. Clara remained still. Your point? My point is simple. Temporary victories often create permanent mistakes. Clara almost admired the warning. It sounded threatening while remaining technically polite. Margaret had always excelled at that. If you have something to say, say it. Margaret folded her hands elegantly. Very well. London is talking. I noticed. People are beginning to ask questions. People always ask questions. Margaret's smile sharpened. Not these questions. Clara felt the first stirrings of concern. Not fear. Instinct. The same instinct that had warned her during difficult business negotiations with her father years ago. Margaret believed she possessed leverage. What questions? Clara asked quietly. Margaret's eyes gleamed. Questions about why a healthy young duchess has not conceived. There it was again. The same wound. The same pressure. Yet this time something felt different. Deliberate. Planned. Clara studied her carefully. You seem unusually invested in the subject. I care about my family's future. No. Clara shook her head. You care about control. For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked. Only slightly, yet Clara saw it. That alone felt like a victory. Before Margaret could respond, another voice interrupted. Am I intruding? Both women turned. Alexander stood in the doorway leading from the drawing room to the terrace. He wore a dark afternoon coat. Sunlight outlined his figure against the interior shadows. Clara had not known he planned to attend. Neither, apparently, had Margaret. A brief silence followed. Margaret recovered first. Alexander. Margaret. His voice revealed nothing. Clara glanced between them. She expected confrontation. Instead, Alexander simply crossed the terrace and stopped beside her. Not in front of her. Not protectively. Beside her. The distinction mattered. Margaret noticed it too. Her expression hardened. I see. Alexander looked at his sister calmly. Do you? You continue encouraging this situation. Clara nearly rolled her eyes. Margaret seemed incapable of discussing anything without sounding vaguely theatrical. Alexander remained unmoved. What situation? The illusion that everything is fine. Clara spoke before Margaret could continue. Everything is fine. Margaret laughed. Of course it is. Clara met her gaze directly. You appear disappointed by that. Silence followed. Several women inside the drawing room had noticed the exchange. Curious faces drifted toward nearby windows. Watching. Waiting. Exactly what Margaret wanted. Public scene. Public pressure. Public embarrassment. Clara suddenly understood. Margaret was not attempting to convince Alexander. She was attempting to damage Clara's reputation. Again, the realization brought unexpected clarity. She straightened her shoulders. I think this conversation is finished. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You do not dismiss me. No. Clara smiled politely. Life keeps doing that for me. For one beautiful second, Margaret looked completely speechless. Alexander's mouth twitched. Barely. Yet Clara caught it. So did Margaret. Color rose in her cheeks. You have changed. Clara looked directly at her. No. I have simply stopped apologizing for existing. The words hung in the air, stronger than she intended, stronger than she realized she felt. Around them, even the observers inside seemed surprised. Margaret stared at her, then at Alexander. Finally, she stepped backward. This is not over. Clara's smile remained perfectly calm. Then perhaps next time bring a better argument. Margaret left without another word. The terrace fell silent. Spring sunlight warmed the stone beneath Clara's feet. Inside, conversations slowly resumed. Alexander looked down at her. A better argument? Clara felt her composure crack into genuine amusement. It sounded more impressive in my head. To her astonishment, he laughed. A real laugh. Brief but unmistakable. The sound transformed his entire face. Then it vanished. Yet the memory remained. Alexander offered his arm. Shall we return inside? Clara slipped her hand through it. Yes. Together they walked back into the drawing room. Not Duke and Duchess performing a role. Not yet. But something had changed. The women watching them noticed it immediately. So did Clara. For the first time since entering London's aristocratic world, she no longer felt alone beneath its scrutiny. And that realization frightened her far more than the rumors ever could. The following week should have been uneventful. Instead, It became the week Clara finally understood how determined society could be when denied the scandal it wanted. Since the gathering at Lady Ashcombe's townhouse, the rumors had only multiplied. The difference was that they had changed shape. Before, people whispered that the Duchess of Harrington might be unable to provide an heir. Now they whispered about something else. They whispered about the Duke himself. More specifically, they whispered about the way he looked at his wife. Clara discovered this accidentally during a meeting of the Harrington Women's Relief Committee, one of several charitable organizations supported by the estate. She sat at the head of a polished walnut table while local organizers reviewed budgets for educational grants and assistance programs. The work required concentration. Numbers always did. Yet even there, where discussions should have remained practical, curiosity found a way inside. Mrs. Pennington, a respectable widow with a talent for collecting information, cleared her throat delicately. "You seem happier lately, Your Grace." Clara glanced up from a ledger. "Do I?" "I believe so." Several women exchanged knowing smiles. Clara recognized that expression immediately. It was the expression people wore when they believed they knew something before the subject did. "Perhaps I have simply been busy." "Perhaps," Mrs. Pennington agreed. Her tone suggested she believed no such thing. By the time the meeting ended, Clara felt oddly relieved. Estate finances were easier than social politics. Numbers at least behaved honestly. People rarely did. She left the committee room and stepped into the grand central hallway. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows. The house seemed brighter than usual. Spring had fully arrived. Gardens that had appeared gray only weeks earlier now burst with color. Even Harrington House itself felt transformed. Clara paused beside a marble table displaying fresh roses. The household staff had embraced her leadership more quickly than she expected. Inventories were organized. Expenses had improved. Several long-standing inefficiencies had quietly disappeared. She found satisfaction in solving problems. More surprising still, she found herself enjoying the challenge. "You look pleased with yourself." Clara turned. Alexander stood near the staircase. He had removed his gloves and carried several documents beneath one arm. "Should I not be?" she asked. "That depends." "On what?" His gaze drifted toward the roses. "Whether you are planning to become impossible to live with." Clara laughed. "I have only balanced 3 departmental budgets." "Precisely." A hint of amusement softened his expression. "Power changes people. Then I shall endeavor to remain humble." "Good." He started toward the library, then stopped. "The charity reports?" Clara lifted the ledger in her hand. "Excellent. I expected they would be." Before she could respond, he continued walking. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Yet Clara found herself smiling long afterward. It was becoming alarmingly easy to smile around him. That realization lingered throughout the afternoon. By evening it had become impossible to ignore. Unfortunately, the evening brought new complications. Harrington House hosted a small dinner that night. Nothing extravagant. Only a dozen guests. Local landowners. Family acquaintances. Several neighboring aristocrats. The sort of gathering designed to maintain social relationships without attracting excessive attention. At least that had been the intention. Clara should have known better. Social attention had begun following her everywhere. The dining room glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Candlelight reflected from polished silver and fine china. Conversations flowed politely around the long table. For nearly an hour everything proceeded smoothly. Then Lady Winthrop arrived late. Clara recognized her immediately. The woman possessed an extraordinary ability to transform innocent observations into strategic weapons. By dessert, she demonstrated the talent again. "The roses are magnificent this year," Lady Winthrop remarked, "particularly the heritage varieties." Several guests nodded politely. "The gardens have received considerable attention," Clara replied. "The results are obvious." Lady Winthrop smiled. "Some things simply require patience." Clara sensed danger. "That is true. Nature follows its own schedule." More smiles appeared around the table. Clara nearly admired the subtlety. Nearly. An excellent observation. Lady Winthrop folded her napkin. One cannot rush important outcomes. There it was. Not direct enough to challenge. Not innocent enough to ignore. Several guests suddenly became fascinated by their dessert plates. Others looked carefully away. Clara felt the familiar pressure settle around her. The expectation. The waiting. Society loved these moments. It loved watching women navigate humiliation disguised as conversation. Once she might have retreated. Once she might have changed the subject. Not anymore. Clara lifted her coffee cup calmly. Fortunately, worthwhile outcomes rarely require public commentary. Silence followed. Lady Winthrop blinked. I beg your pardon? I simply mean that constant observation rarely improves results. Clara smiled pleasantly. Whether one is discussing roses, finances, or family matters. A few guests hid smiles behind crystal glasses. Lady Winthrop's expression tightened. I was only making conversation. Of course. Clara's tone remained perfectly gracious. Across the table, Alexander said nothing. He did not intervene. He did not rescue her. He simply watched. At first, that surprised her. Then she understood. He was allowing her space to fight her own battle. Not because he did not care. Because he trusted her. The realization strengthened her more than any defense could have. The conversation moved elsewhere. Yet the evening left Clara thoughtful. After the guests departed, she walked alone through the south gallery. Moonlight spilled across the marble floor. Portraits watched from gilded frames. The house felt peaceful. At least until she heard familiar footsteps approaching. Alexander joined her near a row of tall windows. You handled Lady Winthrop well. Clara looked outside. You noticed. Everyone noticed. A smile touched her lips. I expected you to say something. During dinner? Yes. Alexander leaned one shoulder against the window frame. Why? Clara considered that. Because you usually do. No. His answer came immediately. Clara turned toward him. No. I intervene when necessary. His gaze met hers steadily. Tonight was not necessary. She studied him. The moonlight softened the sharp lines of his face. You believed I could handle it myself. I knew you could. The certainty in his voice unsettled her in the best possible way. Clara looked away first. The silence that followed felt warm rather than awkward. That frightened her slightly. Feelings were dangerous, particularly in marriages built upon practical arrangements. The next afternoon brought another test. This one far more public. Lady Ashcombe hosted a spring charity reception in one of London's most fashionable neighborhoods. Attendance was practically mandatory for anyone hoping to remain visible within elite society. Clara understood the importance. She also understood the risk. Public events had become hunting grounds for speculation. Nevertheless, she attended. The reception occupied several elegant drawing rooms connected by wide archways. Nearly 100 guests mingled beneath glittering chandeliers. Music drifted softly from a quartet near the far wall. Clara spent the first hour speaking with donors and organizers. Everything proceeded smoothly. Too smoothly. She should have recognized the warning signs. Trouble arrived wearing pale lavender silk and a perfectly practiced smile. Margaret. The room seemed to notice her immediately. Conversations softened. Heads turned discreetly. The atmosphere shifted. Clara continued speaking with a committee member as though nothing had happened. Inside, however, her pulse quickened. Margaret approached slowly, deliberately, like someone entering a stage. Your Grace. Clara inclined her head politely. Margaret. You look well. Thank you. Marriage seems to agree with you. Clara almost laughed. Margaret had never complimented anyone sincerely in her life. Around them, listeners multiplied. Not obviously. Never obviously. People simply drifted closer. Clara recognized the pattern. They were waiting for entertainment. Margaret smiled. I hear the household accounts are flourishing. They are. Wonderful. Her eyes sharpened. It is always reassuring when a duchess excels somewhere. The insult arrived wrapped in velvet. Several nearby guests stiffened. Clara felt the trap opening beneath her feet. Margaret wanted a reaction. Public embarrassment. Public doubt. Public weakness. Instead, Clara smiled. I agree. Margaret blinked. You agree? Entirely. Clara accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing servant. Competence is reassuring. A few people laughed softly. Margaret's smile faltered. Only for a moment. Then she recovered. One hopes all important responsibilities will prove equally successful. There it was again. The heir. Always the heir. Always the same implication. Clara took a slow sip of water. Success comes in many forms. Does it? Margaret asked sweetly. Before Clara could answer, movement near the entrance drew attention across the room. The conversations quieted almost instantly. Alexander had arrived. He crossed the reception hall with the calm confidence that always seemed to part crowds without effort. Clara watched as several guests straightened instinctively. Others stepped aside. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply entered a room. Margaret noticed him as well. Her smile brightened. Dangerous. Calculated. Clara knew that expression. Margaret intended one final performance. Perfect timing, she said. Alexander reached them and stopped beside Clara. Once again, not in front of her. Beside her. Good afternoon. His voice remained calm. Margaret folded her hands. We were discussing responsibilities. Alexander looked at Clara. Were you? Clara met his gaze. She understood the question hidden beneath the words. Are you all right? Do you want me involved? The answer surprised her. She did not need rescue. Not this time. We were having a fascinating conversation. A spark of approval appeared in his eyes. Tiny. Brief. Real. Margaret saw it. Her expression hardened. Clara saw that too. For the first time, she understood something important. Margaret's resentment had never been entirely about heirs or family duty. It was about influence, control, the certainty that she knew what was best for Harrington House. And now that certainty was slipping away. Margaret opened her mouth, perhaps intending another attack, perhaps intending something worse. Clara never learned which, because at that exact moment, Lady Ashcombe called for attention from the center of the room. A fundraising announcement interrupted the gathering. The opportunity vanished. Margaret's jaw tightened. Clara almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The reception continued. Donations were announced. Applause followed. Conversations resumed. Yet through it all, Clara remained aware of Alexander's quiet presence nearby. He spoke with donors, greeted acquaintances, participated in discussions. Still, whenever she glanced across the room, she found him there. Not watching her constantly, not hovering, simply present. The distinction mattered. By the time the evening ended, Clara understood something she had been resisting for weeks. The protection Alexander offered had never been about possession. It had never been about appearances. He was not shielding her because she was fragile. He stood beside her because he believed she deserved to stand there. Equal, respected, seen. And as their carriage rolled through the moonlit streets toward Harrington House, Clara found that realization infinitely more dangerous than any rumor London could invent. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning wrapped in ordinary paper and sealed with nothing more remarkable than dark blue wax. Clara nearly ignored it. By that point, Harrington House received dozens of letters every week. Invitations, requests, charitable correspondence, social obligations. Most required attention. Very few carried genuine importance. This one appeared no different. She sat at her writing desk overlooking the eastern gardens while sunlight streamed through the windows. Spring had matured into early summer. Roses bloomed in thick waves of color below. Birds moved through the hedges. The world looked peaceful. The letter changed that. Clara broke the seal absent-mindedly and unfolded the pages inside. The moment she recognized the handwriting, her breath caught. Dr. Samuel Everett. New York. She had not seen that name in nearly 8 years. For several seconds she simply stared at the paper. Old memories surfaced unexpectedly. Fever, long nights, concerned voices outside a bedroom door. Her mother refusing to leave her bedside. She lowered herself into the chair more fully and began reading. The words blurred at first, then sharpened, then struck like cold water. Dear Miss Whitfield, while your recovery has exceeded expectations, I believe honesty requires me to note that severe inflammatory illness occasionally creates complications affecting future fertility. Such outcomes are not certain. Many women experience no lasting difficulties. However, I recommend ongoing observation and appropriate medical consultation when marriage becomes a consideration. Clara stopped reading. The room suddenly felt smaller, warmer, too warm. She closed her eyes. 8 years vanished. She was 18 again, thin from illness, weak from weeks confined to bed. Her father pretending optimism while fear lingered behind his smile. The doctors had spoken carefully at the time. No guarantees, no predictions, only possibilities. Eventually life moved forward. Her strength returned. The letter disappeared into storage among other medical documents. Years passed. Nothing happened. Until now. Slowly Clara opened her eyes again. Her gaze returned to the page. The words had not changed. They remained exactly as she remembered. Yet everything around them had. 8 years ago she had been an unmarried girl with her entire future ahead of her. Today she was the Duchess of Harrington. A woman already under relentless scrutiny regarding heirs. A woman whose marriage existed within a society obsessed with succession. Her fingers tightened around the paper. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. Clara immediately folded the letter. Too quickly, almost guiltily. "Come in." Eleanor entered carrying fresh flowers. "Good morning, Your Grace." "Good morning." Clara slipped the folded pages beneath another stack of correspondence. The movement felt unnatural. Eleanor approached the vase near the window. "The roses from the south garden have finally opened." Clara forced herself to smile. "They are beautiful." Eleanor arranged the flowers while describing upcoming household schedules. Clara listened. Or at least she appeared to listen. In reality, her thoughts remained trapped inside the folded letter hidden on the desk. The maid eventually departed. Silence returned. Clara immediately retrieved the pages and read them again. Then a third time. The contents did not become less troubling through repetition. The letter proved nothing, confirmed nothing. It merely suggested a possibility. Yet possibilities possessed power, particularly when society already expected failure. She rose abruptly and crossed to the window. Below, gardeners moved through the grounds carrying tools and baskets. Life continued. Practical, ordinary, simple. Clara envied that simplicity, because one question now echoed endlessly inside her mind. Should she tell Alexander? The answer seemed obvious. Husbands and wives should not keep secrets. At least that was the ideal. Reality felt more complicated. Their marriage had never been built upon complete emotional transparency. Respect, trust, cooperation. Yes, deep personal vulnerability. Not yet. More importantly, what exactly would she tell him? That a doctor once warned of a possibility? That she possessed no evidence, no diagnosis, no certainty? The thought exhausted her. By afternoon she had hidden the letter inside a locked drawer beneath several account books. Felt cowardly. It also felt necessary. Unfortunately, secrets rarely remain hidden for long. 3 days later Clara attended a committee meeting in London regarding a new educational initiative funded through several aristocratic families. The gathering occupied a private conference room attached to one of the city's oldest charitable institutions. Discussions lasted nearly 2 hours. Budgets were reviewed. Partnerships were negotiated. By the time the meeting concluded, Clara felt relieved to be leaving. She descended the front steps into warm afternoon sunlight. Her carriage waited at the curb. So did an unexpected figure. Margaret. Clara stopped immediately. Margaret stood beside the carriage wearing pale gray silk and an expression of perfect confidence. "Good afternoon." Clara remained where she was. This is becoming a habit. What is? Appearing unexpectedly wherever I happen to be. Margaret smiled faintly. Perhaps our social circles overlap. Perhaps. Neither woman believed that. A brief silence followed. Carriages rolled past on the busy street. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalks. The city carried on around them. Margaret stepped closer. You look tired. Clara ignored the comment. Did you need something? Actually, yes. The answer arrived too quickly. Clara felt warning bells begin to ring. Margaret folded her gloves carefully. I received a rather interesting piece of information. There it was. The opening move. Clara kept her expression neutral. Congratulations. Margaret's smile widened. You are becoming difficult. I am becoming busy. For a moment irritation flashed across Margaret's face, then disappeared. Tell me, have you spoken with any doctors recently? Every muscle in Clara's body went still. Only years of social training prevented a visible reaction. Margaret watched her closely, waiting, hunting. Clara forced herself to remain calm. No. Interesting. Margaret tilted her head. I expected a different answer. Clara studied her carefully. Why? Margaret's smile returned. Because people talk. Fear flickered briefly through Clara. Not fear of Margaret herself. Fear of what she might know. What she might suspect. What she might be searching for. People always talk. True. Margaret adjusted one glove. Particularly about inheritance. Clara suddenly understood something important. Margaret did not know. Not yet. She was fishing. Probing for weakness. Looking for confirmation. Relief mixed with fresh concern. If Margaret was asking questions, then someone else might eventually do the same. I am afraid you will need a more interesting hobby. Margaret laughed softly. Perhaps. Then her eyes sharpened. Although some secrets eventually reveal themselves, Clara met her gaze steadily. Only if they are secrets. For several seconds neither woman spoke. Then Margaret stepped aside. Enjoy your afternoon. Clara entered her carriage without responding. Only once the vehicle began moving did she allow herself to exhale. Her hands trembled slightly. She hated that. More than fear itself, she hated evidence of fear. The carriage carried her through London's busy streets toward Harrington House. Outside the window, life unfolded normally. Vendors sold flowers. Children chased one another through small parks. Clerks hurried between offices. None of them knew how fragile certainty could become. That evening Clara attempted to lose herself in work. Household reports covered her desk. Expense summaries waited for review. Correspondence required answers. Normally she enjoyed the structure. Tonight nothing held her attention. The letter remained hidden in the drawer beneath her left hand. Felt heavier than paper should. A knock sounded. Clara immediately closed the drawer. Come in. Alexander entered. He carried a folder of estate documents beneath one arm. I hope I am not interrupting. Not at all. He studied her for a moment. Too perceptive. Always too perceptive. You are working late. So are you. Fair point. He crossed the room and placed several papers on her desk. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange. The contact lasted less than a second. Clara hated herself for noticing. Alexander remained standing. Something happened today. It was not a question. Clara's heart tightened. Why would you think that? Because you have reorganized the same stack of papers 3 times since I entered the room. Clara looked down. Unfortunately, he was correct. I see. Also, a faint hint of amusement entered his voice. You only become excessively polite when something is bothering you. She almost smiled. Almost. That is a terrible habit. It is remarkably useful. Silence followed. Clara wanted to tell him. The impulse arrived suddenly. Unexpectedly. She wanted to open the drawer. Hand him the letter. Explain everything. Instead she looked away. It was a long day. Alexander watched her carefully. Not pushing. Not demanding. Simply waiting. The patience made everything harder. Finally he nodded. Very well. Disappointment flickered through her. Ridiculous disappointment. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Clara. She looked up. Yes. His expression softened slightly. Whatever it is. Her pulse quickened. What? You do not have to carry it alone. The words settled quietly between them. No dramatic declarations. No pressure. Just an offer. Simple. Sincere. Dangerous. Because for one brief moment Clara almost accepted it. Then fear returned. Fear of expectations. Fear of disappointment. Fear of changing everything before she understood what needed changing. She managed a small smile. Thank you. Alexander held her gaze for several seconds. Perhaps sensing the truth she refused to speak. Perhaps simply worried. Eventually he nodded once and left. The door closed softly behind him. Clara remained motionless. The room felt impossibly quiet. After several minutes she opened the drawer again. The letter waited exactly where she left it. Silent. Ordinary. Powerful. She unfolded the pages slowly. Then read them once more beneath the glow of a single lamp while darkness gathered beyond the windows. And for the first time since arriving at Harrington House, Clara wondered whether the greatest threat to her marriage was not society, or Margaret, or even the endless pressure surrounding heirs. Perhaps the greatest threat was the secret she was now keeping from the one person she increasingly wished she could trust completely. The secret lasted for more days. 4 days of carefully controlled expressions. 4 days of hiding a folded letter inside a locked drawer. 4 days of convincing herself that she simply needed more time before deciding what to do. By the 5th day, Clara realized she was no longer hiding the truth from Alexander. She was hiding from the conversation itself. That realization arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon. Summer sunlight poured across Harrington Estate. The grounds shimmered beneath a cloudless sky. Staff moved between gardens carrying baskets of fresh flowers. Somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted from a group of village children attending a charity event sponsored by the estate. Everything appeared bright. Everything appeared easy. Clara felt neither. She stood alone in the east garden beside a fountain surrounded by white roses. The letter rested inside her reticule. She had carried it with her for reasons she could not fully explain. Perhaps because leaving it behind felt dangerous. Perhaps because keeping it close felt worse. Water trickled softly through the fountain basin. The sound should have been calming. Instead it seemed to amplify every anxious thought moving through her mind. You are staring at that fountain as though it owes you money. Clara startled and turned. Alexander approached along the stone path. He had removed his coat and rolled his sleeves to his forearms. A rare sight. Most dukes managed to look formal even while walking through gardens. Alexander somehow looked more imposing without trying. I was thinking. That usually leads to trouble. A faint smile touched her lips. You sound remarkably confident about that. Experience. He stopped beside her and looked toward the fountain. Household crisis? No. Charitable committee disagreement? No. Accounting catastrophe? Thankfully not. Alexander folded his arms. Then it is something personal. Clara felt her stomach tighten. He arrived at the truth too quickly. Not the details. The direction. She looked away. Why do you assume that? Because when you are worried about practical matters, you solve them. His voice remained calm. When you are worried about something emotional, you avoid it. Clara laughed softly despite herself. That is disturbingly accurate. I know. Silence settled between them. Comfortable silence. Dangerous silence. The kind that encouraged honesty. Alexander did not press further. He simply remained beside her. Watching sunlight move across the water. Watching roses shift gently in the breeze. Waiting. The patience finally broke something inside her. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Like a knot slowly loosening after being pulled too tight. May I ask you something? She said quietly. Of course. Clara kept her eyes on the fountain. Have you always wanted children? The question surprised him. She could tell immediately. Not because he reacted visibly. Because he became very still. That is an unexpected question. I know. He considered it for several moments. No. Clara looked at him. No. Not always. She had expected a different answer. Most aristocratic men spent their lives preparing for heirs, preparing for succession, preparing for the continuation of family lines. Alexander's response unsettled her. Then when did you start wanting them? His gaze shifted toward the distant hills beyond the estate. When I realized I was expected to. Clara felt something cold settle inside her chest. The answer sounded familiar. Too familiar. That is not the same thing. No. A faint shadow crossed his expression. It is not. Clara waited. Something told her this mattered. Something told her she was standing at the edge of a truth he rarely shared. Alexander rarely spoke about himself, about feelings, about family. Yet today the walls seemed lower somehow, more fragile. Finally he continued. My father cared about legacy more than happiness. His voice remained even, matter of fact, yet Clara sensed old pain beneath the control. He believed every generation existed to preserve the next. That sounds reasonable. It sounds reasonable because you are hearing the polished version. Clara fell silent. Alexander looked toward the fountain. I was 10 years old when he first explained my responsibilities. 10? He nodded once. The estate, the title, the family name, the expectations. A humorless smile touched his mouth. He spoke about marriage before I understood what marriage was. Clara felt her heart tighten. That is absurd. Welcome to aristocratic tradition. The words carried no bitterness. Somehow that made them sadder. Did he ever ask what you wanted? Alexander laughed softly. The sound held no amusement. No. Clara lowered her eyes. Suddenly she understood something she had never considered. Society constantly discussed women as though their primary purpose involved marriage and children. Yet aristocratic sons carried burdens of their own. Different burdens. Equally relentless. Alexander continued speaking before she could respond. The first time I inherited responsibility for a section of the estate, I was 14. 14. My father believed responsibility built character. Clara studied his profile. Strong, controlled, calm. The image of a powerful duke. Yet for a moment she could almost see the boy beneath it. The 14-year-old expected to carry generations of expectations before reaching adulthood. And if you failed? She asked quietly. Alexander's eyes remained fixed on the fountain. Failure was not discussed. The answer landed heavily between them. Clara understood immediately. Some families shouted disappointment. Others never needed to. Silence accomplished the same thing. That must have been lonely. The words escaped before she could stop them. Alexander finally looked at her. Really looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise. Recognition. Yes. The simple answer carried years within it. Clara swallowed hard. I am sorry. You did not create it. No. Neither did I. Another silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Reflective. Clara realized she had never heard Alexander speak this openly. Not once since their wedding. Not once since they met. He trusted her enough to tell the truth. The realization brought both comfort and guilt. Because she still carried a secret. One he knew nothing about. Do you ever resent it? She asked. The expectations? Alexander smiled faintly. Sometimes. Only sometimes? I am trying to appear noble. Clara laughed. A real laugh this time. The tension eased slightly. How admirable. Thank you. For several moments they stood quietly together. Summer wind stirred the roses around them. Somewhere nearby, birds moved through the hedges. The estate felt peaceful. Yet Clara's thoughts remained tangled. Finally she asked the question that had haunted her for weeks. Do you ever worry about heirs? Alexander's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. You already know the answer. I want to hear it. His gaze settled on her face. Careful. Attentive. Why? Clara looked away. She could not tell him. Not yet. The letter seemed to burn inside her reticule. "Please." Alexander studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes." Her stomach dropped. Of course. She had known the answer before asking. Yet hearing it still hurt. Alexander continued before she could respond. "I worry because everyone else worries." Clara blinked. "What?" "The estate depends upon succession. The title depends upon succession. Half of Parliament seems emotionally invested in succession." A trace of dry humor entered his voice. "It becomes difficult to avoid the subject." Clara stared at him. Something felt unfinished. "That is not what I asked." "No." He met her gaze steadily. "It is not." Silence stretched. Then Alexander spoke again. More quietly, more honestly. "What I fear is becoming the kind of man who values an heir more than the people around him." Clara's breath caught. The fountain continued its gentle rhythm. Water, wind, silence. She barely heard any of it. "Why?" she whispered. Alexander looked toward the estate, toward generations of history surrounding them. "Because I know what it feels like to become a responsibility before becoming a person." The words shattered something inside her. Suddenly Margaret's insults made sense in a different way. The endless questions about heirs, the pressure, the scrutiny, the reduction of human beings into functions. Clara had assumed she carried that burden alone. She did not. Alexander had been carrying a different version his entire life. "You think they treated you that way?" "I know they did." No anger, no resentment, just certainty. Clara looked down at her hands. Emotion tightened her throat unexpectedly. For weeks she had been terrified that Alexander might see her as society saw her. As a potential mother, a future heir's mother, a solution, an obligation, a role. Yet the man standing beside her understood the danger better than anyone, because he had lived it. Alexander watched her carefully. "Clara." She looked up. "What is it?" The question was gentle, not demanding, not suspicious, concerned. She almost told him, almost reached into her reticule and handed him the letter, almost explained everything. Instead, fear returned, familiar and stubborn. "Nothing." Alexander did not believe her. She saw that immediately, yet he did not challenge the answer. "All right." Clara hated the relief she felt, hated the disappointment that followed it. Both emotions existed at once, contradictory and equally painful. They began walking slowly through the gardens. The conversation drifted toward safer topics. Charitable projects, estate improvements, village concerns. Yet something fundamental had changed. The distance between them felt smaller. Not because of romance. Not yet. Because of understanding. For the first time Clara saw the wound Alexander carried beneath his composure. And for the first time she realized that beneath all the titles and expectations, beneath the pressure and responsibility and legacy, they shared the same fear. Neither of them wanted to become a function. Neither wanted their worth measured by what they could provide. And as they walked together through the summer sunlight, Clara understood something that terrified her far more than the letter hidden inside her reticule. She was no longer afraid of losing Alexander's respect. She was afraid of losing Alexander himself. 2 weeks later, the first invitation arrived. Clara knew it mattered before she even opened the envelope. The paper was expensive. The seal belonged to the Ashcroft family, one of the oldest aristocratic houses in England. Their summer gathering attracted politicians, financiers, noble families, and nearly everyone who considered themselves important. Refusing the invitation would attract attention. Accepting it would attract even more. Clara sat in the morning room turning the envelope between her fingers while sunlight streamed through the windows. Across from her, Alexander reviewed estate reports over coffee. "You are glaring at the invitation," he observed without looking up. "I am evaluating it." "That sounds more diplomatic." Clara smiled faintly. "I have learned from the best." Alexander finally lifted his gaze. "Should I be concerned?" "Possibly." She handed him the card. He scanned the contents. "The Ashcroft Summer Assembly." "Exactly. You have attended before. Not under current circumstances. Understanding appeared immediately. The rumors, the speculation, the endless fascination with the duchess who had not yet produced an heir. Alexander placed the invitation aside. Then we attend. Clara sighed. That was disappointingly decisive. You expected hesitation? A little. No. His expression remained calm. We attend. Clara should have found the certainty reassuring. Instead, it made her nervous. Public events had become increasingly exhausting. Every ballroom contained whispers. Every dinner contained observations disguised as concern. Every gathering eventually circled back to the same subject. She no longer feared the conversations themselves. What frightened her was the secret she still carried. The letter remained hidden, unspoken, unresolved, and every passing week made the silence harder to justify. 3 days later, the Ashcroft estate shimmered beneath bright summer sunshine. Hundreds of guests filled the sprawling property. Elegant tents stretched across manicured lawns. Musicians performed beneath white canopies. Servants circulated with refreshments. It looked less like a social event and more like a carefully orchestrated display of wealth. Clara stepped from the carriage beside Alexander and immediately felt dozens of eyes turn toward them. Not because they were unusual, because they were expected. The Duke and Duchess of Harrington had become interesting. Society always preferred people when they could be discussed. Smile, Alexander murmured. Clara glanced at him. That sounds suspiciously like an order. A recommendation. Much better. A hint of amusement touched his eyes. They joined the crowd together. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. Clara greeted acquaintances, discussed charitable projects, endured several thinly disguised questions about married life. Nothing she had not handled before. Then she saw Margaret. Her sister-in-law stood near the center of the lawn speaking with several prominent guests. The sight alone did not surprise Clara. Margaret remained well-connected. What surprised her was the woman standing beside her. Young, elegant, beautiful. The woman wore pale blue silk that complemented golden hair arranged with effortless precision. She laughed at something Margaret said, and several gentlemen nearby immediately paid attention. Clara felt a strange sensation she could not identify. Not concern. Not exactly. Instinct. Margaret noticed her watching and smiled. That alone was enough to cause alarm. Trouble? Alexander asked quietly. Clara nodded toward the lawn. Your sister appears unusually cheerful. Alexander followed her gaze. His expression cooled immediately. I see. Do you know her? The question escaped before Clara could stop it. Alexander studied the young woman briefly. Lady Evelyn Moore. Clara repeated the name silently. She had heard it before. Vaguely. Somewhere. Then memory surfaced. Evelyn Moore. Daughter of a wealthy earl. 23 years old. Beautiful. Accomplished. Frequently mentioned in society columns. More importantly, frequently mentioned as a desirable future bride. A small knot tightened in Clara's stomach. She hated it instantly. You know her. Alexander looked at her. Everyone knows her. That should have reassured her. It did not. Margaret had not brought Lady Evelyn here by accident. Nothing Margaret did happened accidentally. As if summoned by the thought, Margaret began crossing the lawn toward them. Lady Evelyn accompanied her. Clara straightened instinctively. Alexander. Margaret's smile appeared perfectly pleasant. What a delightful surprise. Alexander looked entirely unconvinced. Margaret. Lady Evelyn curtsied gracefully. Your Grace. Her voice carried warmth, confidence, charm. Clara immediately understood why society adored her. Lady Evelyn turned toward Clara. And Your Grace. It is lovely to finally meet you. Clara returned the greeting politely. Likewise. For several minutes conversation remained harmless. Weather, charitable events, mutual acquaintances. Lady Evelyn handled social exchanges with remarkable skill. She was intelligent, well-spoken, charming without appearing artificial. Clara found herself liking her despite every instinct urging caution. That made everything worse. Then Margaret shifted the conversation. Of course she did. Lady Evelyn recently became engaged in several estate improvement projects, she said. She has an extraordinary understanding of family legacy. There it was. Subtle. Deliberate. Clara almost admired the technique. Almost. Lady Evelyn appeared mildly embarrassed. Margaret exaggerates. Not at all. Margaret smiled. You understand the importance of preserving family lines better than most. Clara saw it then. The trap. Not aimed at Lady Evelyn. Aimed at her. Margaret wanted comparison. Wanted contrast. Wanted everyone standing nearby to imagine a different duchess beside the Duke of Harrington. A younger woman. A more suitable woman. A woman without rumors attached to her name. Lady Evelyn seemed to realize something was wrong. Her smile faltered slightly. I think family means many things. Of course. Margaret's tone remained sweet. Still, continuity matters. Alexander's expression hardened. Clara noticed immediately. So did Margaret. Yet before he could speak, Clara surprised herself. Continuity does matter. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Clara smiled calmly. Although reducing a family to biology alone seems rather limiting. Silence followed. Brief. Noticeable. Lady Evelyn looked relieved. Margaret looked irritated. Alexander looked impressed. The last reaction unsettled Clara more than the others. Margaret recovered quickly. An interesting perspective. Thank you. Clara accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing servant. I find people often underestimate the value of character. Lady Evelyn nodded immediately. I agree. The answer came so quickly that everyone looked at her. Color touched her cheeks. My apologies. I simply meant that families are shaped by more than inheritance. Clara studied the younger woman. Genuine. Sincere. Not a participant in Margaret's schemes. Merely a useful prop. The realization shifted something inside her. Her frustration no longer focused on Evelyn. It focused entirely on Margaret. The conversation eventually dissolved. Other guests approached. Introductions were made. Yet throughout the afternoon Clara noticed a pattern. Margaret repeatedly maneuvered Lady Evelyn into Alexander's vicinity. During luncheon. During a garden tour. During a discussion about local charities. The attempts became impossible to ignore. By evening, society had begun noticing too. Whispered observations followed them through the event. Lady Evelyn would make a wonderful duchess. Lady Evelyn possessed excellent breeding. Lady Evelyn understood aristocratic expectations. Clara overheard fragments everywhere. None spoken directly to her. All intended for her. The worst part was that Lady Evelyn herself appeared increasingly uncomfortable. During a break between activities, Clara found the younger woman alone near a rose garden. Lady Evelyn. Evelyn turned. Relief appeared immediately. Your Grace. Clara approached slowly. May I ask you something? Of course. Did you know Margaret intended this? Evelyn's eyes widened. Then she sighed. Not at first. Honesty. Unexpected and refreshing. Clara waited. Evelyn looked down briefly. She invited me to several gatherings. Introduced me to various people. Spoke often about Harrington House. Understanding settled into place. And eventually? Evelyn grimaced. Eventually I realized she was presenting me as a solution to a problem. Clara stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, both women laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the absurdity had finally become impossible to ignore. I am sorry, Evelyn said quietly. You should not be. I dislike being used. Clara's smile softened. On that subject, we are in complete agreement. For the first time all day, Evelyn relaxed. The moment lasted only seconds before footsteps approached. Margaret again. Clara nearly admired the persistence. Nearly. There you are, Margaret said. Her gaze moved between them. Suspicion flickered briefly. We were having a pleasant conversation, Clara informed her. Margaret's expression suggested she found that deeply disappointing. The evening concluded shortly afterward. Guests departed beneath golden sunset skies. As Clara and Alexander returned to their carriage, exhaustion settled over her shoulders. Not physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, the kind created by endless evaluation, endless comparison, endless judgment. The carriage door closed behind them. Silence filled the interior. For several moments neither spoke. Then Alexander looked at her. "You know there is nothing between Lady Evelyn and me." The statement arrived so suddenly that Clara blinked. "I did not ask." "No." A faint smile touched his mouth. "You did not." Heat rose unexpectedly to her cheeks. Annoying. Extremely annoying. She looked toward the window. "She seems very nice." "She does." "Intelligent." "Yes." "Beautiful." Alexander watched her carefully. "Clara." She turned back. His expression remained calm, steady, entirely too perceptive. "Lady Evelyn is not my wife." Her heart stumbled. Just once. Enough to matter. Neither spoke afterward. The carriage continued through the gathering twilight toward Harrington House. Outside, summer fields rolled past beneath fading sunlight. Inside, Clara sat very still. Because for the first time since finding the letter, another fear had begun competing with the old one. Not fear of losing her position. Not fear of society. Not even fear of Margaret. Fear of how much Alexander's opinion had come to matter. And fear of what might happen when the secret she still carried finally came into the light. The letter disappeared on a Thursday. Clara did not realize it immediately. The morning began like countless others. Household reports awaited review. Correspondence required signatures. Charitable accounts demanded attention. Summer sunlight spilled across her desk while servants moved quietly through Harrington House. Everything appeared normal. That illusion lasted until shortly after noon. Clara opened the drawer where she had hidden Dr. Everett's letter and found empty space. At first she assumed she had misplaced it. She searched the drawer carefully, then the desk, then every folder and ledger surrounding it. The letter remained missing. A cold sensation spread through her chest. Not panic. Not yet. Something worse. Recognition. Someone had taken it. She sat motionless for several seconds. Her mind raced through possibilities. Eleanor? Impossible. The maid had served her faithfully for months. Household staff? Unlikely. No servant would risk such a violation. That left a much smaller list of suspects. Clara closed the drawer slowly. Margaret. The name arrived immediately. Certain. Unwelcome. She stood and crossed toward the window. Below, gardeners worked among flower beds beneath a brilliant blue sky. The world continued as though nothing had happened. Meanwhile, her secret had vanished. A knock sounded. Clara turned sharply. "Come in." Eleanor entered carrying a stack of invitations. One look at Clara's face made the maid stop. "Your Grace." Clara forced herself to breathe. "Has anyone entered my study this week without permission?" Eleanor frowned. "Not that I know of." Then something seemed to occur to her. Although Lady Margaret visited 3 days ago, Clara felt the answer settle into place. Solid. Inevitable. 3 days ago? Briefly. "You were meeting with the village committee." Eleanor looked increasingly concerned. She said she wished to retrieve several family documents from the West Wing archives. Clara closed her eyes. Of course. Of course Margaret had found a reason to enter the house. Of course she had chosen a moment when Clara was occupied elsewhere. And of course she had not been searching for family records. "Thank you, Eleanor." The maid hesitated. "Is something wrong?" Clara managed a small smile. "Not yet." The answer frightened her because it was true. Not yet. The real damage had not happened. The real damage was still coming. 3 days later, Harrington House hosted its annual midsummer dinner. More than 30 guests attended. Local aristocrats, political allies, family acquaintances, influential figures whose opinions shaped conversations throughout London. Under ordinary circumstances, Clara would have welcomed the event. Tonight she dreaded it. Since discovering the missing letter, A sense of impending disaster followed her everywhere. Margaret had remained silent. Too silent. The silence itself felt threatening. Clara dressed carefully that evening. A deep sapphire gown. Simple jewelry. Nothing designed to attract attention. She wanted invisibility. Experience suggested she would receive the opposite. The dining room glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Candlelight reflected across polished silver and sparkling glassware. Conversations flowed easily. Laughter rose and fell. From the outside, everything appeared elegant, civilized, controlled. Clara took her place beside Alexander at the long table. Across from them sat several prominent guests. Further down sat Margaret. She had arrived unexpectedly that afternoon, officially as a gesture of reconciliation, unofficially for reasons Clara increasingly feared she understood. Throughout the first course, Margaret remained charming, pleasant, engaging. She laughed at appropriate moments, complimented the menu, discussed current events. Anyone unfamiliar with her might have mistaken the performance for sincerity. Clara knew better. The second course arrived. Then the third. Still Margaret waited. Patience had always been one of her most dangerous qualities. Alexander seemed aware of the tension. Several times Clara caught him watching his sister with quiet suspicion. Yet even he could not predict what came next. Dessert had just been served when Margaret set down her spoon. The movement was small, deliberate. Clara felt her stomach tighten instantly. "There is something I have been meaning to discuss." The room did not fall silent immediately. Conversations continued, then gradually slowed. People sensed opportunity. Margaret smiled gently. "I hesitate to raise family matters publicly." Clara nearly laughed at the absurdity. Margaret loved public family matters, particularly when they humiliated other people. Alexander's expression hardened. "Then do not." A sensible suggestion. Margaret ignored it completely. "I recently discovered something rather concerning." Several guests exchanged glances. Clara felt her pulse begin to pound. Margaret reached into a small evening bag resting beside her chair. Then she withdrew a folded piece of paper. Clara stopped breathing. The letter. The room seemed to narrow around her. Candlelight blurred briefly at the edges of her vision. Alexander noticed immediately. His gaze shifted from Clara to the paper in Margaret's hand. Something cold entered his expression. "Margaret!" His voice carried warning now. Real warning. She smiled sadly. "I only want honesty." Clara had never hated a sentence more. Margaret unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately, every movement designed for maximum effect. Apparently a physician in New York expressed concerns many years ago regarding potential fertility complications. Silence crashed across the dining room. Total. Absolute. Dozens of faces turned toward Clara. Some shocked. Some curious. Some sympathetic. None fully understanding. Margaret continued. "Which raises an important question." Alexander rose to his feet. "Enough." The single word cut through the room. Yet Margaret pressed forward. Did Clara know? Clara closed her eyes briefly. There it was. The accusation hidden beneath everything else. Not infertility. Deception. Fraud. Manipulation. Margaret wanted them all to believe Clara had knowingly entered the marriage under false pretenses. Wanted them to believe she had trapped Alexander. Bought a title. Stolen a future. The room waited. Everyone waited. Alexander's hands tightened at his sides. Clara could see the anger building behind his composure. She knew what would happen next. He would defend her, silence the room, destroy Margaret's argument. The realization struck unexpectedly. If she allowed that to happen, the truth would remain buried beneath his protection. And she was tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of fear. Tired of letting other people define the story. Clara rose slowly from her chair. The movement startled several guests. Margaret looked almost triumphant. Alexander looked alarmed. "Clara." She met his gaze briefly, then turned toward the room, toward the judgment, toward the whispers waiting to become certainty. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. Yet when she spoke, her voice remained steady. Yes. The room froze. Margaret blinked. Excuse me? Clara straightened her shoulders. I knew about the letter. Shock rippled across the table. Not because of the admission, because she had offered it willingly. Margaret recovered first. Then you admit it. Clara looked directly at her. I admit that a doctor once warned of a possibility. She paused. A possibility, not a certainty. Margaret opened her mouth. Clara continued before she could interrupt. I was 18 years old. I had recovered from a serious illness. My physician believed honesty required discussing every potential outcome. The room listened. No one moved. No one spoke. Clara felt strangely calm. The fear had finally broken. What remained was truth. I have never received a diagnosis. Her gaze swept across the table. I have never been told I cannot have children. Margaret's smile began to fade. But the risk exists. Yes. Clara nodded. The risk exists. She looked down briefly, then back up. Just as risk exists for countless women who never receive letters. Silence again. Heavier now. More thoughtful. Margaret tried one final time. And yet you married Alexander without revealing it. There it was. The accusation she truly wanted. Clara met her gaze steadily. No. Margaret frowned. No. Clara drew a slow breath. I married Alexander because our families arranged a marriage. Because neither of us promised guarantees that no human being can honestly make. Her voice strengthened. I did not conceal a diagnosis. I concealed a fear. The words hung in the air. Raw. Honest. Real. Clara turned toward Alexander. For the first time that evening, she looked only at him. I was afraid. His expression changed instantly. The anger disappeared. Something deeper replaced it. Something that hurt to witness. Afraid that if the possibility became more important than the person, I would become exactly what society already wanted me to be. Her throat tightened. A function. Recognition flashed across his face. Immediate. Powerful. He understood. Of course he understood. They had spoken about this in the garden. About expectations. About becoming responsibilities before becoming people. Clara continued quietly. I was afraid you would look at me and see a problem to solve. The room no longer mattered. The guests no longer mattered. Even Margaret no longer mattered. Only this. Only the truth. Alexander stared at her for several seconds. Then his gaze shifted toward the letter in Margaret's hand. Slowly, deliberately, the silence became almost unbearable. Margaret seemed to realize too late that something had gone wrong. Very wrong. Because the room was no longer judging Clara. It was judging her. And for the first time since arriving at Harrington House, Clara stood completely exposed before society with nothing left to hide. Yet somehow she had never felt stronger. No one moved. The grand dining room remained suspended in a silence so complete that even the distant ticking of the mantel clock seemed loud. Clara stood beside her chair. Her hands were steady now. The confession she had feared for weeks no longer belonged to her alone. The truth sat openly on the table beside crystal glasses and silver candlesticks. For the first time since finding the letter, she no longer carried it by herself. Across the room, guests stared in stunned disbelief. Some looked at Clara. Others looked at Margaret. Most watched Alexander. Everyone understood that whatever happened next would define the evening. Margaret seemed to recognize it as well. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. Then she straightened. I only wanted transparency. The words sounded weaker now, less convincing. Alexander slowly turned toward her. The movement was calm, controlled, dangerous in a way anger never could be. He had not raised his voice once. That frightened Margaret more than shouting ever would have. Transparency. His tone remained perfectly even. Margaret swallowed. Yes. Alexander looked at the letter in her hand. Then at the guests surrounding the table. Then back at his sister. You stole a private medical document. The words landed heavily. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Margaret immediately lifted her chin. I was protecting this family. No. Alexander's answer arrived without hesitation. You were humiliating my wife. Silence followed. Margaret laughed nervously. You continue making everything about Clara. Clara felt dozens of eyes turn toward Alexander. Waiting, measuring, expecting. For months society had speculated about what mattered most to the Duke of Harrington. His title, his estate, his legacy, his future heir. Tonight they would finally receive an answer. Alexander remained standing at the head of the table. Candlelight reflected in the crystal around him. The room felt smaller somehow, as though the weight of his attention consumed all available space. Everything should be about Clara. Margaret blinked. So did half the guests. Alexander's gaze never left his sister. She is my wife. The words carried no dramatic flourish. No performance. Only certainty. Absolute certainty. Margaret shook her head. You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious. Clara felt her breath catch. Margaret looked around the room as though searching for support. She found none. Even those who previously agreed with her now appeared uncomfortable. The evening had shifted too far. Too publicly. Too completely. Still she persisted. This estate requires an heir. Alexander's expression did not change. The estate requires integrity. The family line must continue. The family line survived centuries before either of us existed. Margaret stared at him. You are willing to risk everything. For the first time, emotion appeared in his voice. Not anger. Conviction. No. His eyes moved briefly toward Clara. I am refusing to sacrifice everything that matters for something that might happen tomorrow. The room seemed to stop breathing. Clara certainly did. Margaret's face paled. You would place one woman above Harrington itself? Alexander answered immediately. Yes. Shock rippled visibly across the table. Not because of the sentiment. Because of the certainty behind it. Powerful men often made grand declarations. They rarely meant them. Alexander meant every word. Everyone could hear it. Everyone could see it. Margaret took a step backward. This is madness. Alexander looked at her quietly. Do you know what is madness? His voice remained low. Every guest leaned closer. Believing a woman's worth begins and ends with what she can provide. Margaret opened her mouth. He did not allow her to interrupt. Believing fear should be punished. His gaze sharpened. Believing loyalty means destroying people you claim to love. The words struck harder than any accusation. Because they were true. Margaret knew it. The room knew it. Even Clara knew it. Margaret's confidence finally cracked. I was trying to help. Alexander's expression softened. Not with sympathy. With disappointment. Somehow that seemed worse. No. He looked at the letter again. You found a private fear and turned it into entertainment. The silence that followed felt painful. Not for Clara. For Margaret. For the first time, the judgment she had spent months directing at others had returned to her. Several guests looked away. Others lowered their eyes. Nobody rushed to defend her. Nobody wanted to stand beside cruelty once it had been exposed. Clara watched Margaret carefully. Beneath the pride and certainty, she suddenly looked smaller. Not powerless. Not defeated. Simply exposed. Alexander drew a slow breath. Then he spoke words that would be repeated throughout London before sunrise. I did not marry a womb. The room froze. Even the servants standing along the walls seemed stunned. Alexander continued. Calm. Clear. Uncompromising. I married a woman. His gaze found Clara. Not briefly. Not accidentally. Deliberately. A woman of intelligence. Clara felt her throat tighten. A woman of dignity. Her vision blurred slightly. A woman who has shown more courage tonight than anyone else in this room. Silence again. Heavy. Meaningful. Real. Clara could not look away. Neither could he. For months she had feared this moment. Feared that the truth would alter everything between them. Instead it revealed something she had never dared hope for. Alexander had never been waiting for an heir. He had been seeing her all along. Margaret's voice emerged weakly. You are choosing emotion over responsibility. Alexander finally turned back toward his sister. No. His answer carried the weight of absolute conviction. I am choosing humanity over obsession. Margaret lowered her eyes. The fight had left her. Everyone could see it. Yet Alexander was not finished. You are no longer welcome to involve yourself in Harrington affairs. Several guests gasped softly. Margaret looked up sharply. Alexander. No. His tone ended the protest immediately. You have interfered repeatedly. You have spread rumors. You have violated trust. He paused. You will not do so again. The finality in his voice settled over the room like stone. Margaret stared at him, then at Clara. For a brief moment something vulnerable appeared beneath her anger. Regret, perhaps, or shock. Then it vanished. She gathered herself carefully. Pride remained. Pride always remained. Without another word, she placed the stolen letter on the table. Then she turned and walked toward the door. No one stopped her. No one followed. The doors closed softly behind her. The sound echoed through the room. Silence returned. Different this time. Not tense. Reflective. Guests avoided one another's eyes. Several appeared embarrassed by their own participation in months of speculation. Others looked openly ashamed. Clara remained standing. She felt strangely light, as though a burden she had carried for years had finally been removed. Alexander crossed the distance between them. Not quickly, not dramatically, simply with purpose. He picked up the letter from the table, folded it once, then handed it to her. Clara accepted it with trembling fingers. I am sorry. The words surprised her. For what? His gaze softened. For making you believe you had to face that alone. Emotion rose so suddenly that she could not answer. For a moment she feared she might cry in front of 30 guests. The possibility would have horrified her a month earlier. Tonight it barely mattered. Alexander lowered his voice. You never needed to earn your place here. Clara stared at him. The room disappeared. The guests disappeared. Everything disappeared except the quiet certainty in his eyes. You already had it. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Only silence. Yet somehow that silence felt larger than any celebration. Around them, everyone present understood they had witnessed something rare. Not a scandal. Not a social conflict. Something far more unusual. A man with every reason to choose legacy had chosen loyalty instead. A woman who had been reduced to a question of fertility had reclaimed her identity in front of an entire room. And for the first time since arriving at Harrington House, Clara no longer felt like someone waiting to be judged. She felt seen, truly seen. And as the candles flickered above the long dining table, she realized the greatest victory of the evening had nothing to do with Margaret, or rumors, or society. It was the simple truth that Alexander Graves had looked at her when everyone else looked at the future. And he had chosen her. The morning after the dinner felt strangely quiet. Not because Harrington House had changed. The servants still moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency. The gardens still glowed beneath summer sunshine. Estate business still waited on desks and in ledgers. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The secret was gone. The fear was gone. And for reasons Clara could not entirely explain, that frightened her more than either of them ever had. She stood in her dressing room watching sunlight spread across the floorboards. Eleanor adjusted the final ribbon on her morning gown and stepped back with a satisfied smile. You look well, Your Grace. Clara studied her reflection. She looked exactly the same chestnut hair, the same gray-blue eyes, the same woman who had stood in the dining room the previous evening. Yet she felt different, lighter in some ways, more uncertain in others. Do I? Eleanor nodded. Everyone is talking about last night. Clara laughed softly. That is hardly surprising. Not in the way you think. Eleanor hesitated. The staff are proud of you. The words caught her off guard. Proud? You told the truth. Eleanor smiled warmly. Most people spend their lives avoiding that. After the maid left, Clara remained still for several moments. Proud. The word lingered. Not because it flattered her, because she realized how long she had spent trying to earn approval from the wrong people. A knock interrupted her thoughts. She expected a servant. Instead, a footman entered carrying a single envelope on a silver tray. "For your grace." Clara accepted it. The handwriting was immediately recognizable. Alexander. She frowned. The Duke of Harrington lived in the same house. There was absolutely no practical reason for written correspondence. Curious, she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message contained only one sentence. "If you have not yet made plans for the afternoon, I would like to show you something." Clara stared at the note. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. The sound surprised even her. An hour later, she found Alexander waiting beside the south entrance. He stood near the carriage wearing a dark coat despite the warmth of the day. The sight instantly reminded her of something. Not a husband. Not a duke. A nervous man attempting not to appear nervous. The realization nearly made her smile again. "You sent me a letter." Alexander looked mildly uncomfortable. "I did. We reside in the same house. I am aware. You could have spoken to me." A faint hint of color touched his expression. "In retrospect, yes." Clara folded her arms. "What exactly is happening?" For the first time in months, Alexander looked genuinely uncertain. "I am attempting something." "That sounds ominous." "I hope not." The answer came so sincerely that Clara could not help laughing. Alexander relaxed slightly. "Will you come with me?" She should have refused, at least according to common sense. Instead, she nodded. "Very well." The carriage carried them nearly 20 miles beyond the estate. Rolling fields gave way to small villages and winding country roads. Clara spent most of the journey trying unsuccessfully to discover their destination. Alexander refused every attempt. "You are being mysterious." "I am trying. Most people accomplish it more naturally." "That is not encouraging." By the time they arrived, Clara found herself enjoying the conversation far more than the mystery itself. The carriage finally stopped beside a modest building overlooking a lake. Clara stepped outside and blinked in surprise. A boathouse? Alexander exited the carriage. "Not exactly." He led her around the side of the structure. Beyond it stood a small schoolhouse surrounded by gardens. Children's voices drifted through open windows. Clara stared. "What is this?" "The Whitfield Learning Center." She turned sharply toward him. "The what?" Alexander looked almost pleased with himself. "The Whitfield Learning Center." Clara could only stare. "Alexander, you mentioned several months ago that educational opportunities in rural areas were limited." He glanced toward the building. "I agreed." Clara felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "You built a school?" "Technically, the villagers built most of it." "That is not the point." A group of children emerged from the building carrying books and laughing. One little girl waved enthusiastically toward them. Clara waved back automatically. The child grinned and disappeared around the corner. Alexander watched her reaction carefully. "You once told me that wealth should create opportunities." Clara remembered the conversation. A casual discussion months earlier. One of dozens they had shared. She had not realized he remembered. "You listened." The words emerged softer than intended. "I always listen." Her heart stumbled. Once, then again. Dangerous. Extremely dangerous. They spent the afternoon touring the school, meeting teachers, speaking with local families, watching children explore shelves filled with books. Clara loved every minute of it. More importantly, Alexander seemed content simply watching her enjoy it. By the time they returned to Harrington House that evening, she understood something alarming. The day had felt less like an obligation and more like a courtship. The realization followed her upstairs, followed her through dinner, followed her into sleep. The next morning another letter arrived. This one waited beside her breakfast plate. Clara unfolded it cautiously. "The roses in the West Garden are finally blooming. I have been informed that I should appreciate them properly. Would you join me at 4 o'clock? She stared at the note. Then at Alexander seated halfway down the table reviewing correspondence. He did not look up, did not acknowledge the message. The man was pretending innocence. Badly. Clara bit back a smile. For a clock found her in the west garden. Alexander was already there. The roses were beautiful. That was not the point. The point was that he spent an hour walking beside her discussing everything except heirs, obligations, family expectations, and social pressure. They talked about books, travel, childhood memories, absurd village disputes. The conversation felt effortless, and that frightened Clara more than anything else, because she was beginning to understand what he was doing. He was not repairing their marriage. He was building something they had never possessed. 3 days later, another letter appeared. Then another. Picnic beside the lake. A visit to a village festival. A tour of a restored greenhouse. None of the invitations were extravagant. None carried romantic declarations. Yet each felt deeply personal, carefully chosen, thoughtful, intentional. One evening Clara sat in the library reading the latest note when Eleanor entered carrying fresh flowers. The maid noticed her smile immediately. Another letter? Clara attempted dignity. Possibly. Eleanor looked entirely unconvinced. Of course. After the maid departed, Clara examined the note again. Contained only a few lines. Simple handwriting. No flourishes. No dramatic language. Yet somehow she treasured every one of them, which was precisely the problem. Because the more Alexander revealed of himself, the more Clara questioned her own certainty. She thought of the dining room, the public defense, the unwavering loyalty, the promises he never actually spoke aloud yet somehow communicated through every action. Most women would have accepted that as proof. Clara could not. Not completely. 1 week after the dinner, she finally understood why. The realization arrived during another carriage ride. Alexander sat across from her discussing plans for a new village clinic. The late afternoon sun illuminated one side of his face. He looked relaxed, happy even. Clara realized she had not seen him this content before. The discovery brought unexpected sadness, because she still did not know whether his feelings came from affection or responsibility. Had he defended her because he loved her, or because he believed protecting her was the honorable thing to do? The difference mattered, more than she wanted to admit. The carriage rolled through golden fields. Alexander continued speaking. Clara barely heard him. She was too busy confronting an uncomfortable truth. Somewhere between the letters and the conversations and the schoolhouse beside the lake, she had fallen in love with her husband. Completely, irrevocably, and for that very reason, she could not remain at Harrington House. Not yet. 2 days later, she stood in Alexander's study holding a travel bag. He looked up from his desk. Surprise immediately crossed his face. Clara? She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times. None of those rehearsals helped. I am leaving for London. Alexander rose slowly. For how long? I am not sure. Silence followed. Heavy. Immediate. Why? The question sounded calm. Too calm. Clara looked away. Because I need time. Time for what? She swallowed hard. To know whether you are choosing me. Confusion appeared first. Then understanding. Then something deeper she could not quite identify. Alexander stepped closer. Clara. She shook her head gently. Please do not make this easier. His expression tightened. I am trying to understand. I know. She drew a slow breath. You defended me. You stood beside me when nobody else would. You have been kind, patient, generous. Her voice trembled slightly. But I do not know whether you are doing those things because you love me or because you believe they are your responsibility. Alexander stared at her, speechless for perhaps the first time in his life. Clara smiled sadly. And I cannot spend the rest of my life wondering. The silence stretched. Neither moved. Finally, Alexander asked the question she feared most. If I ask you to stay? Her heart broke a little. Then I will want to. Honesty hung between them, painful and undeniable. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, she saw something remarkable. Not anger, not frustration, respect. Then I will not ask. Tears threatened unexpectedly. Clara hated that. Thank you. He nodded once. The movement looked difficult. Where will you stay? The townhouse in London. Will you be safe? Clara almost laughed through the emotion. Even now, even here, that was his first concern. Yes. Another silence followed. Then Alexander reached into his pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. Clara looked down. Another letter. You wrote me a letter for this? A faint smile touched his mouth. Apparently it has become a habit. Against all logic, she laughed. Then carefully placed the letter inside her bag. Minutes later she climbed into the carriage waiting outside. As the horses began moving, she looked back one final time. Alexander stood on the front steps of Harrington House, watching, not stopping her, not asking her to stay, giving her exactly what she needed, even though it clearly hurt him to do so. The carriage turned the corner. The estate disappeared from view. Clara leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes. For the first time since their marriage began, Alexander Graves was no longer acting like a duke trying to protect his duchess. And she suspected that before this ended, he would have to decide whether he was willing to become something far more vulnerable. A man asking the woman he loved to choose him in return. London in late summer possessed a particular kind of beauty. The heat softened. The air grew lighter. Even the city seemed to breathe more easily before autumn arrived. Clara noticed all of it and appreciated none of it. 3 weeks had passed since she left Harrington House. 3 weeks of living in the London townhouse. 3 weeks of convincing herself she had made the correct decision. The problem was that the decision felt increasingly difficult to defend. Not because she regretted leaving. She did not. The distance had given her clarity. Unfortunately, that clarity revealed things she had not expected. Most notably, she missed Alexander. She missed his quiet observations, his dry humor, his impossible ability to notice when something troubled her before she noticed it herself. She missed finding letters waiting beside her breakfast plate. Most of all, she missed the strange sense of safety she experienced whenever he entered a room. The realization was humiliating. Clara sat beside the townhouse window watching carriages pass below. A familiar knock sounded. Before she could answer, Eleanor entered carrying a silver tray. "Another letter, Your Grace." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "Of course there is." Eleanor smiled openly now. She had abandoned any attempt at discretion weeks earlier. Clara accepted the envelope. Alexander's handwriting remained immediately recognizable. She waited until the maid departed before opening it. The note contained only 4 lines. "I visited the schoolhouse today. The students have decided the garden requires additional sunflowers. Apparently I have been overruled. I thought you should know." Clara laughed despite herself. "Then read the note again." And again. There was no declaration hidden inside. No pressure. No request for her return. Every letter followed the same pattern. Small observations. Daily moments. Thoughts he might once have shared during breakfast. Nothing more. Nothing less. He never asked her to come home. Somehow that made each letter more powerful. Because every message carried the same unspoken truth. He was choosing her freedom even when it hurt him. A week later another invitation arrived. This one came from Lady Ashcombe. The final grand ball of the summer season. Attendance would be enormous. Half of London society planned to attend. Clara placed the invitation aside immediately. She had no interest in ballrooms. No interest in speculation. No interest in becoming the subject of whispered conversations again. Unfortunately, society rarely respected personal preferences. 2 days later, Lady Ashcombe appeared in person. Clara received her in the drawing room. Tea was served. Polite conversation followed. Then the older woman placed her teacup down and smiled knowingly. Clara immediately became suspicious. "What?" Lady Ashcombe laughed. "You always ask that when you suspect manipulation. Because manipulation usually follows." "Fair point." The older woman folded her hands. You are attending the ball. Clara sighed. I am not. You are. No. Yes. Clara stared. Lady Ashcombe remained completely untroubled. Would you like to hear my argument? Not particularly. Excellent. I shall provide it anyway. Clara groaned softly. Lady Ashcombe smiled. You have spent weeks hiding. I have not been hiding. You relocated to another residence and declined 6 social invitations. Clara frowned. You counted. Everyone counted. Unfortunately, that was probably true. Lady Ashcombe leaned forward slightly. My dear, society already believes the story has ended. Clara looked away. The words unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Ended. The possibility felt wrong somehow. Incomplete. Lady Ashcombe watched her carefully. Attend the ball. Why? The older woman smiled gently. Because sometimes people deserve the opportunity to finish speaking. Clara understood immediately. Alexander. She should have objected. Instead, she remained silent. 3 nights later, the ballroom glittered beneath thousands of lights. Crystal chandeliers transformed the vast space into a sea of gold and silver reflections. Music drifted across polished floors. Elegant guests filled every corner. It was exactly the sort of event Clara normally enjoyed. Tonight she felt nervous. Ridiculously nervous. She entered alone. The moment she crossed the threshold, conversations shifted. Heads turned. Not hostile. Curious. The separated Duchess of Harrington had become a topic of endless fascination. Clara ignored the attention and moved deeper into the ballroom. Several acquaintances greeted her warmly. Others attempted subtle questions. She navigated everything with practiced grace. Yet throughout the evening, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Alexander had not arrived. An hour passed. Then another. Clara hated herself for noticing. Hated herself even more for caring. Music filled the ballroom. Couples danced. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Still no sign of him. By 10 o'clock, disappointment had settled heavily inside her chest. Perhaps Lady Ashcombe had been mistaken. Perhaps there was nothing left to say. Perhaps she had imagined meaning where none existed. The thought hurt more than it should have. You look unhappy. Clara turned. Margaret stood beside her. For one brief second, every instinct urged retreat. Then Clara noticed something unexpected. Margaret looked different. Not weaker. Not defeated. Simply tired. The sharp certainty that once defined her seemed diminished. Good evening, Clara said carefully. Margaret nodded. May we speak? Clara considered refusing. Instead, she gestured toward a quieter corner near the terrace doors. They crossed the room together. Several observers immediately became interested. Old habits died hard. Once they reached relative privacy, neither woman spoke immediately. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. I owe you an apology. Clara blinked. She had prepared for many possibilities. This was not one of them. Margaret looked away briefly. A real apology. The admission clearly cost her something. Clara waited. Margaret drew a slow breath. I convinced myself I was protecting Harrington. Her voice sounded different. Less polished. More honest. The truth is that I was protecting my own idea of Harrington. Clara remained silent. Margaret continued. You changed things. Yes. People listened to you. A humorless smile touched Margaret's mouth. Including Alexander. Understanding settled into place. Not jealousy exactly. Fear. Margaret had feared becoming irrelevant. Feared losing influence. Feared change itself. I never intended to replace you, Clara said quietly. Margaret laughed softly. I know that now. Silence followed. Then Margaret met her gaze directly. Stealing the letter was unforgivable. Clara felt old pain stir briefly, then fade. Yes. Margaret nodded once. I am sorry. The words were simple. No excuses. No conditions. No manipulation. Just regret. Clara studied her carefully. For the first time since entering Harrington House, she believed her. Thank you. Relief flashed across Margaret's face. small but genuine. Another silence followed. Then Margaret glanced toward the ballroom entrance. "You should turn around." Clara frowned. "Why?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Because my brother finally stopped behaving like an idiot." Clara turned. The world seemed to stop. Alexander stood at the entrance. He wore a formal black evening coat. Candlelight and crystal reflections shimmered around him. Yet Clara noticed none of it. She noticed only him. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. Conversations faded. Music disappeared. Everything disappeared. For several seconds neither moved. Then Alexander began walking toward her. The crowd parted naturally, quietly, as though recognizing something important. Clara felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. By the time he reached her, she could barely breathe normally. Margaret stepped away without a word. For once, she understood exactly what to do. Alexander stopped in front of Clara. Neither spoke immediately. Too much existed between them. Too much history. Too many unsaid things. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket. Clara laughed softly. "Another letter?" A faint smile appeared. "One last letter." He handed it to her. Clara unfolded the page. The handwriting was familiar, steady, direct. She read the single sentence. "I do not know how to ask you to stay because I never wanted you to feel trapped. But I know that every place feels wrong when you are not there." Clara closed her eyes briefly. Emotion rose so quickly it hurt. When she looked up again, Alexander was watching her. Vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. No title, no authority, no protection. Just a man waiting for an answer. "That is a terrible letter," she whispered. His expression tightened. "It is." Clara smiled through gathering tears. "It should have been delivered weeks ago." Relief appeared first, then disbelief, then hope, real hope. "Clara." She stepped closer. "You spent months showing me who you are." Her voice trembled slightly. "The school, the letters, the way you listened, the way you stayed." Alexander said nothing. He simply watched her. "I wanted to know whether you were choosing me." She smiled softly. "You were." The words seemed to strike him physically. Clara had never seen so much emotion in his eyes. Not even close. Music swelled somewhere behind them. The ballroom continued around them. Yet neither paid attention. Finally Alexander extended his hand. "Would you dance with me?" Clara looked at the offered hand. Then at the man offering it. The answer felt remarkably simple. Yes. Together they stepped onto the dance floor. Conversations followed them. Curious eyes watched them. Nobody cared. As the orchestra began the next waltz, Alexander guided her gently into motion. Not possessively, not formally, carefully, like someone handling something precious. Clara laughed softly. "You realize half of London is watching." "I know. That does not concern you?" Alexander looked directly into her eyes. "Not remotely." And for the first time since their marriage began, Clara believed him completely. As they moved beneath the golden light of the chandeliers, surrounded by the very society that had once reduced her to a question of fertility and succession, she realized something extraordinary. The woman who had arrived in England hoping to earn acceptance no longer needed it. Because the one thing she had wanted all along had never been a title or status or approval. It had been to be chosen for who she was. And at last, in front of everyone, she was. 1 year later, the breakfast room at Harrington House looked very different. The room itself had not changed. The same tall windows welcomed the morning sunlight. The same polished table stretched beneath crystal chandeliers. The same gardens bloomed beyond the glass. Yet the atmosphere felt entirely transformed. Laughter existed here now. Conversation existed here. Peace existed here. Clara sat near the center of the table reviewing several letters while a tray of fresh pastries rested nearby. The household had long since adjusted to her leadership. The estate accounts flourished. The village school continued expanding. The Whitfield Learning Center now educated more than 100 children from surrounding communities. 3 additional scholarship programs had been established. A new medical clinic was under construction. Every project reflected the same principle Clara and Alexander had gradually built together. Wealth should create opportunity. Status should create responsibility. Power should create protection. A soft knock sounded. "Come in." Eleanor entered carrying a stack of documents. The maid no longer seemed nervous around her. Few people did. Over the past year, Clara had grown into her role with quiet confidence. She no longer felt like a visitor inside Harrington House. She belonged here. Everyone knew it, including her. "Good morning, Your Grace." "Good morning, Eleanor." The maid placed the documents on the table. The final reports from the Women's Foundation. Clara immediately brightened. The foundation had become one of her most important projects. Several months earlier, she established a charitable organization dedicated to assisting women pressured into marriages based entirely upon inheritance expectations. The work felt deeply personal. Too many women had spent their lives believing their value depended upon what they could provide. Clara intended to challenge that belief whenever possible. She opened the report and smiled. "These numbers are remarkable. The program has helped hundreds already." Clara nodded. Satisfaction warmed her chest. Not pride exactly. Purpose. The foundation mattered. The school mattered. The clinic mattered. Building those things felt far more important than proving herself to society ever had. Eleanor hesitated, then smiled knowingly. "You should tell His Grace." Clara laughed softly. "He already knows." "Probably." The maid glanced toward the doorway. "He tends to know everything." As if summoned by the observation, footsteps approached. A moment later, Alexander entered carrying several folders beneath one arm. A year ago, the sight might have made Clara nervous. Today, it simply made her happy. Alexander stopped beside her chair. "Good morning." "Good morning." He leaned down slightly. Not enough to attract attention. Just enough for intimacy. "You are smiling." Clara looked up. The foundation report arrived. "Good news." "Excellent news." A warmth entered his eyes immediately. Not because of the report itself. Because her happiness mattered to him. Clara still found that astonishing sometimes. Not because she doubted it. Because she no longer did. Alexander placed the folders on the table. "Then we should celebrate." "With what?" "Breakfast." Clara laughed. "Your standards remain admirably practical." "It is one of my finest qualities." They settled into comfortable conversation. Estate matters. Upcoming projects. Correspondence requiring attention. Ordinary things. Wonderful things. The kind of things people rarely appreciate until they almost lose them. Halfway through breakfast, another letter arrived. The butler placed it beside Clara's plate. She immediately recognized the handwriting. Margaret. Alexander noticed as well. For a brief moment, silence settled between them. Not tense. Reflective. A year had changed many things. It had not erased history. Clara opened the envelope carefully. The letter was brief. Respectful. Honest. Margaret wrote from Bath, where she had spent much of the previous year assisting several charitable organizations. Her life had changed as well. Not dramatically. Gradually. She remained proud, strong-willed, occasionally difficult. Some qualities never disappeared entirely. Yet she had also become more thoughtful, more self-aware. Growth rarely arrived all at once. The letter ended with a simple request. Would Clara be willing to meet for tea the next time she visited London? Clara folded the page thoughtfully. Alexander waited. "Well?" She looked up. "She would like to meet." "And?" Clara considered the question. A year earlier, the answer would have been obvious. Anger, distance, refusal. Today things felt different. Forgiveness did not require forgetting. It did not require pretending the past never happened. It simply required refusing to live inside it forever. "I think I will see her." Alexander studied her quietly, then nodded. "I think that is generous." Clara smiled faintly. "I think it is practical." That too. The conversation moved on. Yet the letter remained in Clara's thoughts throughout the morning. Not because it reopened old wounds, because it reminded her how much life could change when people chose growth over pride. Later that afternoon, Clara visited the foundation offices located in a renovated building near the village center. Women arrived daily seeking guidance, legal assistance, educational opportunities, or simply encouragement. Some faced family pressure. Others faced social expectations. Many carried fears remarkably similar to the ones Clara once carried herself. During a meeting with several new applicants, one young woman hesitated before speaking. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" Clara smiled. "Of course." The woman looked down briefly. "How do you stop worrying about what everyone expects from you?" The question touched something deep inside her, because once upon a time she would have given anything to know the answer. Clara considered carefully before responding. "You do not stop immediately." The room grew quiet. "You begin by asking a different question." "What question?" Clara smiled gently. "Who are you when nobody is measuring you?" Several women exchanged thoughtful looks. Clara remembered standing in grand ballrooms, sitting at formal dinners, wondering whether her entire future would be determined by expectations she never created. The memory felt distant now, not because it no longer mattered, because it no longer defined her. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As Clara stepped outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the village in warm golden light. She paused briefly, watching children play near the school, watching families move through the streets, watching life continue. A familiar carriage waited nearby. Alexander sat inside reviewing documents. He looked up immediately when he saw her. Even after a year, the sight still affected her. "How did it go?" he asked as she climbed inside. "Very well." He studied her face. "You look thoughtful." "I was remembering something." "Good or bad?" Clara settled beside him. "Both." Alexander nodded. He understood that answer. They rode home together through the countryside. Fields stretched endlessly beneath the fading sunlight. The estate appeared in the distance. Beautiful. Familiar. Home. The realization still surprised her occasionally. Not because of the house, because of what the word meant. That evening they shared dinner quietly. No grand events. No social obligations. No dramatic conversations. Just peace. Later, after most of the household retired for the night, Clara found herself once again seated at the breakfast table. A habit she had developed whenever she needed time to think. Moonlight filtered through the windows. The room remained silent. She remembered another breakfast, another morning, another version of herself sitting in the same room while judgment and humiliation surrounded her. The contrast felt almost unbelievable. Footsteps approached behind her. She did not need to turn around. "Could not sleep?" Alexander asked. "Not yet." He moved beside her. The silence felt comfortable, familiar, the kind of silence built through trust rather than distance. Clara looked down at the polished table. "Do you ever think about that first breakfast?" Alexander immediately knew which one she meant. "Sometimes." "Me too." He waited. "I spent so much time worrying about whether I could become what everyone expected." Her voice softened. "I never stopped to ask whether those expectations deserved obedience." Alexander smiled faintly. "Most of them did not." Clara laughed. "No." Outside, the gardens shimmered beneath moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called softly. The estate slept peacefully around them. Alexander looked toward her. "Do you regret anything?" Clara considered the question carefully. The rumors, the fear, the separation, the uncertainty, the months spent questioning herself. Eventually she shook her head. "No." Then she smiled. "Although I still think your early letters were terrible." Alexander looked offended. "They were thoughtful. They were awkward. I was attempting romance. You wrote me updates about sunflowers. Important updates." Clara laughed again. The sound filled the room. Warm, easy, real. Alexander watched her for a moment. Then, without saying anything, he set aside the papers he had been carrying and reached for her hand. The gesture was simple, unremarkable, yet it meant everything. Clara intertwined her fingers with his. 1 year earlier she had feared becoming nothing more than a role, a responsibility, a future possibility measured against impossible expectations. Instead she had found something entirely different: respect, partnership, love. Not because she proved herself useful, not because she fulfilled a social obligation, not because she satisfied anyone's demands, because she was herself. The woman who had once been reduced to a question had become the answer to a much more important one. What happens when someone chooses a person over an expectation? As moonlight stretched across the breakfast room and the quiet house settled around them, Clara leaned gently against Alexander's shoulder. He squeezed her hand once. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The future remained uncertain. It always would. Perhaps children would come someday. Perhaps they would not. For the first time, neither possibility frightened her, because happiness no longer depended upon proving her worth. It never had. And in the peaceful silence of Harrington House, surrounded by the life they had built together, Clara finally understood the truth that had been waiting for her all along. Home was never a title, never an estate, never an heir. Home was the person who looked at every expectation in the world, set it aside, and chose you anyway.